They heard something during radio silence that made them question whether to report it at all. 3 astronauts circling the moon in December of 1968, experiencing something so strange during their passes over the far side that years later they would still struggle to describe it. Professional test pilots, men trained to observe and report with precision, reduced to vague emotional descriptions of landscapes that felt wrong and sounds that seemed impossible. That was just the beginning. Before we go further, I want to thank Mike Hunt for suggesting tonight's story. And if you're enjoying this content and listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps us tremendously. If you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. And if you enjoy this kind of deep investigation into mysteries at the edge of human knowledge, please consider subscribing. It means everything to us. And a special thank you to Mike Hunt for suggesting tonight's story. This one's for you. There's something unsettling about a face you can never see. The moon hangs in our sky every night, a constant companion to humanity's existence. Yet we only ever see one side of it. The same craters, the same Maria, the same ancient scars illuminated by reflected sunlight. For thousands of years we assumed that was all there was. We were wrong. The far side of the moon remained hidden from human eyes until the space age, and when we finally glimpsed it, what we found didn't match what we expected. The terrain was different, darker, stranger. And in the decades since, despite all our technological advances, despite satellites and orbiters and landing missions, there are still things about the far side that don't add up. Tonight, we're going to explore what might be hiding on the side of the moon that never faces Earth. Why certain missions experience phenomena they couldn't explain, and why the world's superpowers are now racing to establish permanent infrastructure in the one place in our solar system that's completely shielded from observation. This is the story of the dark side of the moon, and the signal that might be waiting there. Chapter 1. The Side We Never See. To understand why the far side of the moon matters, you first need to understand why it exists at all. The moon is tidally locked with Earth. This isn't magic or coincidence, it's physics. Over billions of years, gravitational forces synchronize the moon's rotation with its orbit. One full rotation takes exactly as long as one orbit around Earth. The result is that the same hemisphere perpetually faces our planet. For all of human history, we could only see roughly 59% of the moon's surface. The rest remained invisible, impossible to observe from Earth. Ancient astronomers could map the visible side in extraordinary detail, but the far side was pure speculation. Philosophers wondered what lay beyond that curve of rock. Some imagined mirror landscapes, identical to what we could see. Others proposed exotic features, unique geological formations that existed nowhere on the visible hemisphere. A few even suggested the far side might harbour life, protected from Earth's observation by the moon's bulk. All of these theories remained untestable until the 20th century brought rocket technology and the space race between global superpowers. That changed in the late 1950s. The Soviet space program launched Luna 3 in October of that year. It was a relatively simple probe by today's standards, weighing less than 300 kilograms and carrying a primitive camera system that used actual photographic film. But its mission was historic. Photograph the far side of the moon for the first time in human history. The mission profile was complex. Luna 3 had to reach the moon, position itself correctly, photograph the hidden hemisphere, develop the film on board using an automated chemical processing system, and then transmit the images back to Earth using a scanning system that converted the photographs into radio signals. Every step had to work perfectly. There were no second chances. If the camera failed, if the film didn't develop, if the transmission system malfunctioned, the mission would return nothing. The probe succeeded. It captured 17 images before its film supply ran out, then transmitted them back to Earth via a primitive scanning system that took hours to send a single photograph. When scientists at the Soviet Academy of Sciences developed those images, they found something unexpected. The far side looked nothing like the near side. where the near side featured broad, dark plains called Maria, ancient lava flows that formed the familiar face of the moon. The far side was almost entirely covered in craters, heavily cratered, densely packed impact scars stretching across nearly the entire visible surface. The contrast was stark and immediately puzzling. Why would one hemisphere be so different from the other? The Maria on the near side were formed when asteroid impacts punched through the lunar crust, allowing molten rock from the interior to flow out and fill the impact basins. This created the smooth, dark plains we recognise from Earth. But the far side showed almost none of this volcanism. The crust there appeared thicker, preventing the same geological process from occurring. Scientists proposed explanations involving crustal thickness variations and the moon's internal structure, suggesting that the far side's thicker crust had prevented volcanic flooding, even when major impacts occurred. The theory was sound, supported by what little data existed about lunar composition, but the images from Luna 3 were grainy, incomplete, and limited in scope. Large portions of the far side remained unmapped. The camera system could only capture about 70% of the hidden hemisphere, leaving significant gaps in coverage. And curiously, the Soviet Union was selective about which images they released to the public. The initial announcement came with great fanfare. The Soviet press celebrated the achievement extensively. Premier Nikita Khrushchev presented Luna 3 images to international scientific conferences as proof of Soviet technological superiority. But some researchers would later note that certain frames from the Luna 3 mission were never published in scientific journals. The official explanation was that they were too degraded to be useful, damaged during the onboard film development process, or corrupted during radio transmission. This explanation was plausible. The technology was primitive, and failures were common. Many early space missions lost significant amounts of data to technical problems. But conspiracy theorists would eventually argue something else, that those missing frames showed something the Soviets didn't want the world to see. Something unusual, something that didn't fit the expected pattern of impact craters and ancient geology. No evidence ever emerged to support this theory. The missing frames remained missing, if they ever existed at all. But the idea planted itself in the minds of people who were paying close attention to lunar exploration. The seed of doubt had been planted. What else might be hidden on the far side? What might those grainy, incomplete images have missed? For now, though, the far side remained mostly a mystery. A heavily cratered alien landscape that no human eye had ever directly witnessed. A place that existed only in low-resolution photographs and scientific speculation. The Soviet achievement had opened a door, but it hadn't revealed what lay beyond. That would require more missions, better technology, and eventually human eyes in lunar orbit. The race to see more had only just begun, and as it intensified, as both superpowers poured resources into lunar exploration, the questions about the far side would only multiply, because the more we looked, the stranger it became. Chapter 2: Mapping the Unknown. By the early 1960s, the United States had entered the space race in full force. The Soviet success with Luna 3 had been a propaganda victory, and American scientists were determined to not just match but exceed Soviet achievements. President John Kennedy had committed the nation to landing humans on the moon before the decade ended. That goal dominated public attention and drove NASA's mission planning. But behind the scenes, there was another priority that received less publicity, but equal scientific importance: comprehensive mapping of the moon's surface, especially the mysterious far side. NASA rapidly developed its lunar exploration program. The Ranger series of spacecraft would crash into the moon while transmitting photographs during their descent. The Surveyor series would soft land and analyze surface, composition, and the Lunar Orbiter series would map the entire surface from orbit, providing the detailed photographs needed to select landing sites for future crewed missions. The initial focus was on understanding the moon's surface composition, topography, and potential hazards for landing spacecraft. Scientists needed to know if the surface was solid or covered in deep dust. They needed to identify flat areas suitable for landing. They needed to map the distribution of boulders and craters that might damage a spacecraft. But there was another priority, one less discussed in public announcements: comprehensive mapping of the far side. The United States launched a series of probes designed to photograph and analyse lunar geography. These missions captured thousands of images, slowly building a more complete picture of the moon's hidden hemisphere. What they found continued to puzzle planetary scientists. The far side wasn't just more heavily cratered, it was fundamentally different in composition. The crust was thicker, as the Soviet findings had suggested. The surface was darker, with different reflective properties than the near side. There were fewer of the smooth basaltic plains that characterised the near side. And perhaps most intriguingly, there were features that didn't quite fit the expected patterns of impact geology. Small anomalies, unusual formations, shadows that suggested geometric precision. Most of these were easily explained as pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist, or as natural geological processes that simply appeared artificial due to lighting conditions and camera angles. Impact craters could create remarkably regular shapes. Volcanic features could produce straight lines. Erosion from micrometeorite bombardment over billions of years could smooth certain formations while leaving others rough, but not all of them. One particular formation, photographed by Lunar Orbiter 3 in early 1967, generated significant internal discussion at NASA. It appeared to be a perfectly straight line, several kilometres long, cutting across the floor of a far-side crater. The line was narrow, perhaps only a few metres wide, but its linearity was extraordinary. Planetary geologists examined the image extensively. They proposed several natural explanations. It could be a fault line, where the lunar crust had fractured and shifted. It could be a lava flow boundary, where different eruptions had created distinct edges. It could even be a camera artifact, a flaw in the imaging system that created an apparent line where none existed. Each explanation had problems. Fault lines on the moon typically showed irregularities and variations. This line was straight to within the resolution limits of the camera. Lava flow boundaries could be linear, but rarely over such distances. And if it was a camera artifact, why didn't similar artifacts appear in other images from the same spacecraft? The formation was catalogued, noted in technical reports, and filed away for future study. NASA's official position was consistent. The far side was scientifically interesting, but not fundamentally mysterious. Everything observed could be explained through conventional planetary science. But there was something the public didn't fully grasp at the time. All of these early observations were done remotely, from orbit, with limited photographic technology. Resolution was poor by modern standards, coverage was incomplete, and most importantly, there was a significant time delay between image capture and public release. NASA controlled the flow of information completely. Researchers within the agency had access to raw data that the public would never see. Classification protocols, initially developed for national security purposes during the Cold War, meant that certain findings could be withheld indefinitely if they were deemed sensitive. The question, of course, is what would qualify as sensitive about lunar geography. The official answer was simple: anything that might give the Soviet Union strategic information about potential landing sites or resource locations. During the height of the Cold War, this justification was accepted without much scrutiny. The military was deeply involved in the space program. Classification was standard procedure. But years later, some former NASA personnel would suggest the classifications went beyond simple Cold War paranoia. They would suggest that some images were classified because of what they showed, not because of where they showed it. These suggestions were always vague, offered in retirement when the consequences of speaking out were minimal. No one provided concrete examples. No classified images were leaked. The claims remained tantalizingly unspecific. But the pattern was clear. Something about far-side observations made NASA nervous in ways that near-side observations didn't. By the mid-1960s, the American space program had shifted focus from simple observation to something far more ambitious, putting humans on the moon. Orbital mapping became a secondary priority. Public attention moved to the astronauts, the rockets, the dramatic countdowns and fiery launches. The Apollo program dominated headlines. Every test flight, every technical milestone, every training exercise became news. The world watched as NASA built the infrastructure to achieve Kennedy's goal of landing humans on the moon before the decade ended. But behind the scenes, the mapping continued, and the anomalies accumulated. Lunar orbiter spacecraft circled the moon, photographing every crater and mountain, building a comprehensive atlas of the surface. They focused on potential landing sites on the near side, but they also systematically imaged the far side. Some of those far side images never made it into the public archives. They were classified immediately upon receipt, reviewed by personnel with appropriate security, clearances, and stored in secure facilities. The stated reason was protection of potential future landing sites or areas of strategic interest. But NASA had already announced that all Apollo landings would occur on the near side, where communications with Earth would be possible. There was no operational reason to land on the far side during the Apollo program. The technical challenges were too great. So why classify far side images if they had no relevance to the Apollo mission? The answer, according to official records, was that the classifications were precautionary. Future missions might explore the far side. Better to protect the information now than worry about it later. Critics would argue this explanation made little sense. Maps of the far side would eventually become public as better missions flew. Classifying them temporarily achieved nothing except creating gaps in the public understanding of lunar geography. Unless, of course, those specific images showed something that NASA wanted time to understand before facing public questions. By the late 1960s, NASA had accumulated more data about the moon than any organisation in history. They had thousands of photographs, millions of data points, comprehensive maps of elevation and composition, and somewhere in that vast archive, according to the conspiracy theories that would later emerge, were images that showed the far side wasn't quite as empty as it appeared. But for now, all of that remained hidden behind security classifications and bureaucratic control of information. The public saw what NASA chose to release. Everything else remained locked away. The first humans would soon orbit the moon, and when they did, they would see the far side with their own eyes, not through camera lenses or photographic film. What they reported from those observations would become the subject of debate and speculation for decades to come. Chapter 3: Apollo 8 and the Silence. December of 1968. Apollo 8 launched from Kennedy Space Center carrying 3 astronauts, Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders. Their mission was unprecedented and extraordinarily risky. They would be the first humans to leave Earth orbit, travel to the moon, and enter lunar orbit. The Apollo program was behind schedule. The lunar module wasn't ready for testing. But NASA was concerned that the Soviet Union might attempt a crude lunar flyby before the United States could land on the moon. The decision was made to accelerate the schedule and send Apollo 8 to lunar orbit even without the landing spacecraft. It was an enormous risk. The spacecraft had never been tested in deep space. Navigation systems, while sophisticated for their time, were primitive by modern standards. The crew would travel farther from Earth than any humans in history. If something went wrong, rescue would be impossible. There were dozens of potential failure points, any one of which could strand the crew in space or send them hurtling past the moon into an orbit around the sun from which they could never return. The engine that would slow them into lunar orbit had to fire perfectly, or they would miss the moon entirely. The engine that would bring them home had to work on the first attempt, or they would be trapped in lunar orbit until life support failed. But the mission succeeded. Apollo 8 reached the moon on Christmas Eve and fired its main engine to slow into orbit. For the next 20 hours, the crew circled the moon 10 times, taking photographs, conducting observations, and becoming the first humans to see the far side with their own eyes. Each orbit took approximately 2 hours, and during each orbit the spacecraft passed behind the moon, completely cut off from radio contact with Earth. This wasn't unexpected. Radio waves can't pass through solid matter. When Apollo 8 disappeared behind the lunar horizon, all communications ceased. Mission Control in Houston could only wait, monitoring timers, calculating trajectories, hoping the spacecraft would emerge on schedule. The communications blackout lasted roughly 45 minutes each orbit, During that time, the crew was completely alone, more isolated from humanity than anyone had ever been. They couldn't call for help if something went wrong. They couldn't receive guidance if they encountered problems. They were entirely dependent on their spacecraft, their training, and each other, and they were passing over the far side, seeing landscapes no human eyes had ever witnessed. The crew described the experience in their post-mission reports and subsequent interviews. They spoke of the alien nature of the terrain below. Where the near side was familiar from photographs and telescopic observation, the far side was completely new. Every crater was unnamed. Every mountain range was unknown. They were seeing pristine terrain that had never been viewed by conscious observers. It always did emerge, on schedule. But something about those passages disturbed the crew in ways they struggled to articulate. Years later, during interviews and memoir accounts, the Apollo 8 astronauts would describe the experience of passing over the far side as deeply unsettling. Not because of what they saw exactly, but because of what they felt. The descriptions were vague, almost reluctant. They spoke of an overwhelming sense of isolation, of being farther from humanity than anyone had ever been. They described the landscape below as ancient, hostile, and utterly lifeless. One astronaut mentioned that the far side looked wrong compared to the near side, though he couldn't articulate exactly what he meant. This vagueness is interesting. These were trained test pilots, men selected for their ability to observe and report technical details accurately. They were accustomed to describing complex situations clearly, yet when discussing the far side, their language became imprecise and emotional. Frank Borman, the mission commander, later stated that the far side had a forbidding quality. He described it as looking like it had been worked over by a cosmic sledgehammer for billions of years. This was accurate from a geological perspective. The far side was heavily cratered, but the emotional weight in his description suggested something beyond simple scientific observation. James Lovell described the sensation of radio silence as creating a loneliness that was almost physical. He mentioned that during the far side passes, the crew became quieter, more contemplative. The usual banter and conversation that characterized their communications with Houston stopped when they went behind the moon. William Anders, who took the famous Earthrise photograph showing Earth rising above the lunar horizon, later said that seeing the far side made him understand how truly empty space was. Not just physically empty, but existentially empty. A vast cosmic wasteland where nothing lived and nothing changed. These descriptions could be entirely psychological. The far side passes represented maximum isolation. Every human instinct would react to being completely cut off from Earth, alone on the night side of an alien world. The emotional responses could be perfectly natural reactions to an extreme environment. But the official transcripts of the mission contain something curious. Most of the mission audio is preserved and publicly available. NASA recorded all communications between the crew and mission control, and those recordings have been digitized and released. Researchers can listen to the entire mission from launch to splashdown. But there are gaps in the audio recordings, not during the far side passes, when radio silence was expected and no communication was possible, but during other portions of the mission. Brief sections where the official NASA transcripts simply note unintelligible or technical interference. These gaps are short, usually only a few seconds, and NASA explained them as routine transmission problems caused by distance and equipment limitations. The Apollo communication system was complex, involving multiple tracking stations around Earth, spacecraft systems operating at the edge of their capabilities, and radio signals travelling hundreds of thousands of kilometres. Technical problems were common. Static, interference, and dropped signals occurred regularly during all Apollo missions. The presence of unintelligible sections in the transcripts was not unusual, yet some researchers claim to have obtained alternative recordings, supposedly leaked by unnamed NASA personnel, that contained audio from these gaps. In these unofficial recordings, which began circulating in conspiracy research communities in the late 1970s, the astronauts allegedly discussed seeing unusual things on the far side. Lights where no lights should be, structures that appeared artificial, movement in areas that should be completely static. NASA categorically denied the authenticity of these recordings. They were dismissed as hoaxes, fabrications created by conspiracy theorists to generate attention or support pre-existing beliefs about alien activity. The agency pointed out that no verified source for these alternative audio files had ever been produced. No one had come forward with original recordings. No whistleblowers had provided documentation. And indeed, analysis of the leaked recordings revealed problems. The audio quality was inconsistent with genuine Apollo communications. The background sounds didn't match the spacecraft environment. Some of the conversations included references to things that wouldn't have been visible from Apollo 8's orbital altitude. The recordings were almost certainly fake, but their existence raised interesting questions. Why would someone go to the effort of fabricating detailed audio that sounded like Apollo transmissions? What motivated the hoax? And why did the fabricated conversations focus specifically on far-side observations? One possibility was simply the enduring human fascination with mysteries. The far side represented unknown territory. Creating fake recordings about discoveries there tapped into that fascination and generated attention. Another possibility, suggested by conspiracy theorists, was that the fake recordings were created as a form of disclosure. If something had actually been observed during Apollo 8, but the genuine audio remained classified, then creating fake versions of similar conversations might be a way to introduce the truth disguised as fiction. This theory required believing in elaborate games of misdirection by unknown parties within NASA or the intelligence community. Most researchers found it implausible. The simpler explanation was that someone created fake recordings because they could, and because people would find them intriguing. But one detail particularly bothered some researchers. In post-mission debriefings, the Apollo 8 crew reportedly spent an unusual amount of time discussing their observations of the far side. These debriefings were classified at the time, which wasn't uncommon. Much of the Apollo program operated under military security protocols due to its connections with ballistic missile technology and Cold War competition. What was uncommon was how long those specific debriefing documents remained classified. Most Apollo mission files were declassified within 15 to 20 years. Technical information about spacecraft systems, navigation procedures, and mission operations became public as the Apollo program ended and NASA shifted focus to other projects. The far-side observation reports from Apollo 8 weren't fully released until decades later, and even then, when they finally entered the public domain, significant portions were redacted. The official explanation was that the redactions protected proprietary technical information about camera, systems, and orbital mechanics. Some passages discussed classified military sensor technology that had been adapted for NASA use. Other sections contained information about observation techniques that remained sensitive for national security reasons. Critics argued that this seemed implausible for what should have been straightforward geological observations. The crew was looking at the moon, taking photographs, describing what they saw. What aspect of that required classification extending decades beyond the mission? NASA's response was bureaucratic. The classification had been applied according to standard protocols. The documents had been reviewed on regular schedules. They were declassified when appropriate authorities determined the information was no longer sensitive. This was technically true, but it didn't explain why observations of lunar craters and mountains would be considered sensitive in the first place. The Apollo 8 mission returned to Earth on December 27th, 1968. The crew splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean, completing one of the most ambitious and risky missions in history. They were celebrated as heroes, lauded for their courage and technical skill. Public attention immediately shifted to the next goal, landing on the moon. Apollo 9 and 10 would test the lunar module and verify landing procedures. Apollo 11 would make the attempt. The strange observations from the far side, if they existed at all, were buried under the momentum of the space program's greatest achievement. But for those paying attention, questions remained. What did the astronauts really see during those silent orbits? Why did their descriptions carry such emotional weight? And why did NASA seem so reluctant to discuss those observations in detail? The answers, if they existed, remained locked in classified files and fading memories. But the questions wouldn't go away. As more missions flew, as more astronauts orbited the moon, and passed over the far side, the pattern of strange experiences would continue, and eventually those experiences would include something that couldn't be easily dismissed or explained away. Chapter 4. The Unverified Claims. In the decades following the Apollo program, rumours began to circulate among space exploration enthusiasts and conspiracy researchers. These weren't the usual moon landing hoax claims, which alleged that the entire Apollo program was faked in a television studio. Those theories, while persistent, were easily debunked by examining the evidence. These new rumours were something different, more specific, more troubling. The core allegation was this. During the Apollo missions, particularly those that orbited the moon, astronauts reported hearing strange sounds while passing over the far side. The claims first appeared in the late 1970s, mentioned in fringe publications and UFO research newsletters. They described unusual whistling noises, mechanical tones and rhythmic patterns that couldn't be attributed to spacecraft systems or radio interference. The sounds allegedly occurred only when the spacecraft was over the far side, never during near-side passes. NASA dismissed these claims immediately. Agency spokespeople explained that radio interference, thermal expansion of spacecraft components, and electromagnetic effects in the lunar environment could all produce unusual sounds. The spacecraft itself generated constant noise. Fans, pumps, cooling systems, electrical systems, all creating a background soundscape that astronauts lived with for days or weeks at a time. Human perception in stressful, isolated environments could also create auditory illusions. Pattern recognition in random noise was well documented. The brain would sometimes interpret meaningless sounds as having structure or significance, especially when exhausted or under psychological pressure. All of these explanations were scientifically valid, and for years that seemed to be the end of the discussion. The strange sounds were dismissed as either misperceptions or hoaxes. But in the early 21st century, something unexpected happened. NASA itself released audio recordings from the Apollo 10 mission that seemed to validate at least part of the conspiracy theory. Apollo 10, which flew in May of 1969, was the final dress rehearsal before Apollo 11's historic landing. The crew orbited the moon 31 times, coming within 15 kilometres of the surface during practice runs for the landing approach. It was a comprehensive test of all systems and procedures. During several passes over the far side, the astronauts reported hearing strange whistling sounds through their headsets. The sounds lasted for nearly an hour. They were loud enough that the crew discussed them at length, trying to identify the source. In the recorded conversations, you can hear genuine puzzlement and concern in their voices. You hear that? That whistling sound? Yeah, I hear it too. What's that? It sounds like outer space type music. It's really weird. Should we tell them about this? I don't know. Let's keep monitoring it. The conversation continued for some time, with the crew trying to troubleshoot what they were hearing. They checked their equipment, verified that all systems were functioning normally, and ruled out various technical sources. Eventually, they decided to mention it to Mission Control, though their report was carefully worded. They described it as unusual radio interference, possibly related to electromagnetic effects from the spacecraft's systems. Mission Control noted the report but didn't seem particularly concerned. The mission continued without incident. NASA's explanation, both at the time and when the audio was publicly released decades later, was that the sounds were caused by radio interference between the command module and the lunar module communication systems. The two vehicles were flying in close formation during that portion of the mission, and their radios were both transmitting. This could create interference patterns that produced unusual sounds, a technical glitch, nothing more. But audio analysts who examined the recordings noted something curious. The sounds had structure. They weren't random static or white noise. There were patterns, repetitions, almost musical qualities to the whistling. Some researchers ran the audio through spectral analysis software, converting the sounds into visual representations showing the frequencies and patterns. They claimed to find embedded frequencies that didn't match any known spacecraft systems. The patterns suggested something more than simple radio interference. Others argued this was simply confirmation bias, seeing patterns in random noise because they wanted to find something significant. Human brains are extraordinarily good at finding structure in chaos. Musical patterns especially are something we readily perceive even when they don't objectively exist. What made the story more compelling, however, were the astronauts' reactions. In the recorded conversations, the crew sounds genuinely puzzled by what they're hearing. These weren't men prone to panic or superstition. They were experienced test pilots, engineers, veterans of high-risk military operations. They had been through exhaustive training that prepared them for virtually every contingency. Yet they spent significant time discussing these sounds, trying to identify the source, ruling out equipment malfunctions, and notably they discussed whether to even mention it to mission control, worried about how it might sound. Should we report this? I don't know, it's probably nothing. But it's been going on for a while now. Let's wait and see if it continues. That hesitation is what conspiracy theorists found most interesting. Why would experienced test pilots worry about reporting a technical anomaly unless they suspected it might be interpreted as something more than technical? NASA maintained that the astronauts were simply being cautious, avoiding unnecessary alarm during a critical mission. Apollo 10 was the final test before the moon landing. Every system had to work perfectly. The crew didn't want to create confusion or distraction over something that might be trivial, but skeptics pointed out that these were men who regularly dealt with life-threatening malfunctions. During previous missions, astronauts had calmly reported serious problems, from equipment failures to medical issues. A strange sound shouldn't have prompted that level of concern unless they suspected it wasn't coming from their spacecraft. The Apollo 10 audio became a focal point for far-side conspiracy theories. If genuine anomalies had been recorded during that mission, what else might have been documented and not released? Former NASA personnel, speaking anonymously in interviews years after retirement occasionally, hinted at other incidents, unexplained sensor readings, visual anomalies that didn't match photographic evidence, data that didn't fit expectations. One retired engineer claimed that during Apollo missions, there were instances where ground-based tracking detected unusual electromagnetic signatures coming from the lunar surface. These signatures didn't match any known geological process or solar radiation effect. They appeared briefly, then disappeared, never lasting long enough for detailed analysis. Another former technician mentioned that some mission photographs, particularly from the far side, showed light anomalies that couldn't be explained by camera flares or reflections. Small bright spots in permanently shadowed craters where no light should penetrate. But none of these sources ever provided concrete evidence. No documents were leaked. No photographs were produced. The claims remained tantalizingly unverifiable. What is documented, however, is that NASA became increasingly restrictive about what information from later Apollo missions was made public. Mission transcripts were edited for length and clarity, which was presented as standard practice to make them more readable. Photographs were curated, with only the most scientifically or aesthetically interesting images released. And certain technical data remained classified long after any reasonable national security justification had expired. The pattern suggested something beyond routine information control. It suggested selective disclosure, as if someone within NASA had decided that not everything observed during the Apollo missions should reach public awareness. The question was why, and the answer, if it existed, seemed to be hidden somewhere in the vast archives of lunar observation data that NASA had accumulated over decades of missions. As the Apollo program ended and NASA shifted focus to space shuttle development and orbital stations, public interest in the moon waned. The far side became a scientific curiosity again, studied by planetary geologists but largely forgotten by the general public. But in the emerging internet communities of the 1990s and early 2000s, interest in lunar mysteries remained strong. Researchers shared information, analysed available data, and built networks of people investigating unexplained aspects of space exploration. These communities preserved the Apollo 10 audio, the claims about strange sounds and observations, the hints from former personnel. They kept asking questions even when official sources had moved on to other topics, and eventually their persistence would be validated in an unexpected way. Because modern lunar observation missions would begin detecting anomalies that aligned with the old conspiracy theories, not perfectly, not conclusively, but enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, There had been something to those unverified claims after all. Chapter 5. The modern mapping era. By the 1990s, technology had advanced dramatically. The blurry photographs and limited data from the Apollo era were being replaced by high-resolution orbital imagery from sophisticated unmanned spacecraft. The far side of the moon was about to be mapped in unprecedented detail. Computer processing power had increased exponentially. Digital cameras had replaced film. Spacecraft could carry instruments that analysed composition, measured elevation, detected magnetic fields, and mapped the distribution of elements across the lunar surface. The Clementine mission launched in early 1994. It was a joint project between NASA and the Department of Defense, officially designed to test sensors and spacecraft components for the Strategic Defense Initiative, the missile defense system that had been a priority during the Cold War. But its scientific mission was mapping the moon. Clementine spent 2 months in lunar orbit, capturing over 1.5 million images using multiple cameras and sensors. It mapped the entire surface at resolutions far exceeding anything previously achieved. The data revealed new details about lunar composition, topography, and geological history. The mission discovered ice in permanently shadowed craters near the lunar poles, confirming predictions that water might exist in these cold traps. It measured the thickness of the lunar crust in different regions. It created detailed elevation maps showing the moon's complex topography. It also revealed new anomalies. Researchers analysing Clementine data noticed several unusual features on the far side. Most were quickly explained as natural formations resulting from impact processes, volcanic activity, or erosion from billions of years of micrometeorite bombardment. But a few defied easy categorization. There were areas where the terrain appeared unnaturally smooth, lacking the expected density of small impact craters. Planetary scientists proposed that these areas might have experienced relatively recent geological activity, with lava flows or landslides covering older terrain. But the moon was supposed to be geologically dead, with no significant activity for billions of years. There were shadows that suggested vertical structures, though most of these could be explained as lighting effects on crater walls or boulder formations. The human eye and brain naturally interpret shadows as indicating three-dimensional objects, even when the actual topology is more complex. And there were formations with geometric regularity that seemed statistically unlikely to be purely natural. Linear features, right angles, symmetrical arrangements that appeared too organised to result from random geological processes. NASA published papers about these findings, always with careful scientific caveats. The agency emphasised that unusual didn't mean artificial. Natural processes could create apparently geometric patterns. Volcanic activity could produce straight lines when lava flowed along fault lines. Tectonic stress could create parallel fractures. Impact ejecta could land in organised patterns. Every explanation was scientifically valid. But the accumulation of anomalies began to strain statistical expectations. How many unusual but natural formations could exist before you had to consider that some might actually be unusual because they weren't entirely natural? The images sparked intense debate in online forums and research communities. Amateur analysts began downloading the raw data from NASA's public archives and conducting their own investigations. They created enhancement algorithms to bring out subtle details. They adjusted contrast and brightness to reveal features not visible in the original images. They measured angles and proportions, comparing formations across different regions. Some claimed to find evidence of structures, towers rising from crater floors, bridges spanning chasms, arrangements of objects that appeared deliberately positioned. Even what appeared to be artificial lighting in permanently shadowed craters, sources of illumination that couldn't be explained by reflected sunlight. NASA's response was consistent. People were seeing what they wanted to see. The human brain is wired to recognize patterns, especially artificial ones. This cognitive bias, combined with poor understanding of geological processes and image artifacts, led to false positives. Every alleged structure had a prosaic explanation. Planetary geologists patiently explained how natural processes could create these apparent anomalies. They showed examples from Earth where wind, water and geological forces had created remarkably geometric formations. They demonstrated how lighting angles could create illusions of structures where none existed. Yet the agency's defensiveness struck some observers as excessive. Why devote so much effort to debunking amateur photo analysis if there was nothing to the claims, if the formations were obviously natural? Why not simply ignore the conspiracy theories? The attention NASA gave to refuting these claims suggested they took them seriously, or perhaps that they wanted to ensure these claims remained in the realm of debunked conspiracy theories rather than serious scientific questions. The next major mission came in 2009 with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. This spacecraft carried even more advanced instruments and began what would become an ongoing, comprehensive survey of the entire lunar surface. The resolution was extraordinary. Individual boulders could be identified. Landing sites from the Apollo era were photographed in stunning detail, showing the descent stages of lunar modules and even the tracks left by astronauts' boots and rover wheels. The far side received particular attention. Thousands of images were captured and released to the public through NASA's Planetary Data System, a repository of space mission data accessible to researchers and the public. Scientists could now study the Moon's hidden hemisphere with clarity that would have been unimaginable during the Apollo era. Every crater, every mountain range, every unusual formation could be examined in detail. And yet the anomalies didn't disappear. If anything, they multiplied. Not because there was more evidence of artificial structures, but because higher resolution revealed just how complex and varied the lunar surface actually was. Every new image raised new questions. Why were certain crater patterns distributed the way they were? Statistical models predicted random distributions, but some regions showed clustering that seemed non-random. What caused the unusual reflectivity in specific regions? Some areas appeared brighter or darker than their composition should produce, suggesting unusual surface properties or hidden deposits. Why did some areas show signs of recent geological activity when the Moon was supposedly geologically dead? Small landslides, boulder, movements, changes in surface albedo that suggested ongoing processes. Mainstream lunar scientists had explanations for all of these phenomena. The Moon, they argued, was more dynamic than previously understood. There were ongoing processes driven by temperature variations, micrometeorite impacts, and interaction between solar radiation and surface materials. The Moon wasn't completely dead, just extremely slowly active. But conspiracy theorists noticed something else. They noticed that certain images from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter were never released to the public database. NASA's image archive is extensive, containing hundreds of thousands of photographs taken over years of operation. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter alone has captured millions of images since its arrival in 2009. But researchers comparing the spacecraft's imaging schedule with the publicly available archive found gaps. Times when the orbiter was photographing specific far-side locations, but the resulting images weren't included in the public release. The agency explained that this was routine data management. Not every image was scientifically useful. Some were blurred due to spacecraft motion. Others were overexposed or underexposed. Some were redundant, showing the same terrain captured in previous passes. There was no point cluttering the archive with substandard images that provided no scientific value. This explanation made sense from an operational perspective. No organisation would release every piece of data they collected, especially when dealing with millions of images. Critics argued that this selective curation created opportunities for hiding significant findings. If something unexpected appeared in a photograph, it could simply be excluded from the public database. No explanation required, no questions asked. The image would remain in NASA's internal archives, accessible only to personnel with appropriate clearance. What made this argument more compelling was the fact that several nations now had their own lunar observation capabilities. China, India, Japan, and the European Space Agency had all sent missions to orbit or land on the Moon. They were all capturing their own images, conducting their own analysis, and they were all being just as selective about what they released. China's Chang'e 2 orbiter, launched in 2010, captured high-resolution images of potential landing sites on both the near and far sides. The publicly released images showed impressive detail, but researchers noted that coverage of certain far-side regions was conspicuously absent from the public data. India's Chandrayaan missions provided chemical and mineralogical mapping, detecting water ice, and analysing surface composition. But like NASA and China, the Indian Space Research Organisation curated its data releases carefully. Japan's Kaguya mission, which orbited the Moon from 2007 to 2009, created detailed topographic maps and high-definition video footage. Some of this footage showed the far side in remarkable clarity. But again, not everything captured was released publicly. It suggested a pattern. An unspoken agreement among space agencies that certain information about the Moon, particularly the far side, should be carefully controlled. The question remained, what exactly were they controlling? The official answer was always the same. Mission data required careful validation before release. Scientific integrity demanded thorough review. Not everything captured was suitable for public distribution. All true, all reasonable, but insufficient to explain the specific patterns of what was released and what wasn't. Because if you mapped the gaps in coverage, if you identified which regions were photographed but not publicly released, an interesting pattern emerged. Many of the gaps corresponded to the same locations where earlier anomalies had been reported. The same formations that generated debate during the Clementine mission. The same regions where amateur analysts had claimed to spot geometric structures. It could be coincidence. Those regions might simply be less scientifically interesting, and therefore images of them were deprioritized for public release, or it could be deliberate. Those regions might be more interesting than publicly acknowledged, and therefore images of them were being withheld pending further analysis. The truth, as always, was impossible to determine from the outside. Only people with access to the complete unfiltered datasets would know what had been observed but not released. And they weren't talking. Chapter 6. The Structure Debate. In the mid-2010s, a series of images from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter sparked intense online debate. Amateur researchers had discovered what appeared to be a cluster of geometric formations on the far side, in a region known as the Mare Orientale Basin near a crater named Marion. The formations consisted of several roughly rectangular shapes arranged in an apparently organised pattern. They were small, only a few metres across at most, but their regularity was striking. They appeared to cast shadows that suggested vertical height, not just surface markings or discolorations. The images spread quickly through conspiracy research communities on social media and specialised forums. Analysis was conducted by people with varying levels of expertise, from professional image analysts to enthusiastic amateurs with powerful computers and freely available image processing software. Measurements were taken. The dimensions of the rectangular shapes were calculated. The spacing between them was measured. The orientation relative to local terrain was determined. The consensus among amateur analysts was clear. These were artificial structures. Some proposed they were abandoned installations from an ancient lunar civilization. Others suggested they were artifacts left by extraterrestrial visitors. Few even theorized they were secret human constructions, placed there by classified missions that NASA wasn't acknowledging. The theories varied, but the underlying claim was consistent. These formations were not natural. NASA's response came swiftly, within days of the images gaining widespread attention online. A planetary geologist issued a public statement explaining that the formations were almost certainly boulders ejected during an impact event, which had coincidentally landed in a pattern that appeared organised. This was not unprecedented, the statement continued. Random distributions often created clusters that seemed non-random to human observers. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, evolved to spot threats and opportunities in complex environments. This makes us prone to seeing organisation where none exists. The impact that created the nearby crater would have ejected millions of rocks. Some would land close together. Some arrangements would appear geometric, purely by chance. Probability guaranteed it. The explanation was scientifically sound. Impact ejecta did indeed produce such patterns. Studies of impact events on Earth and other bodies had documented numerous cases of boulders landing in apparently organised arrangements, but skeptics noted that NASA's response came unusually quickly, as if the agency had been prepared for this exact discovery, as if they had known the images would eventually be analysed and had their rebuttal ready. Why would NASA have a prepared response unless they had already analysed these formations themselves and anticipated public interest? The agency never addressed this question directly. The statement was issued, the explanation was provided, and NASA moved on to other topics. But the formation in the Marian crater was just the beginning. More structures, or apparent structures, were discovered over the following years as amateur analysts systematically examined the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter image archive, not just in Marian crater but across the far side. Some appeared to be natural beyond reasonable doubt, others were more ambiguous, and a few seemed genuinely difficult to explain through conventional geology. One particularly contentious example was a formation in the crater known as Tsiolkovsky, a large impact basin on the far side named after the Russian rocket pioneer. Orbital images showed what appeared to be a perfectly straight edge, several kilometres long, cutting across the crater floor. It looked like a wall or a ridge, but its linearity was extraordinary. Natural geological features rarely display such geometric precision over such distances. Planetary geologists examined the formation in detail. They proposed that it represented a fault line, where the lunar crust had fractured during the impact event that created Tsiolkovsky crater. The molten rock that later flooded the crater floor had cooled and contracted, creating linear fractures. This explanation was plausible. Fault lines could indeed be remarkably straight. Cooling lava could produce geometric patterns as it contracted and cracked. But the formation in Tsiolkovsky was straight to within the measurement resolution of the imaging system. No irregularities, no variations in width or orientation, just a perfectly linear feature stretching for kilometres. Statistical analysis suggested this level of linearity was extremely unlikely to occur naturally, though not impossible. Unlikely events happen frequently when you are observing millions of square kilometres of surface. Somewhere, a perfectly straight geological feature would exist purely by chance. The question was whether this specific feature was that statistical anomaly, or whether it represented something else. The debate intensified throughout the 2010s. Online communities dedicated to lunar anomalies grew in size and sophistication. Advanced image processing techniques were shared. Databases of unusual formations were compiled. Statistical analyses were performed to determine whether the distribution of anomalies was consistent with pure chance. Both sides claimed the evidence supported their position. Geologists insisted that everything observed could be explained through natural processes. Conspiracy researchers argued that the pattern of anomalies, taken collectively, suggested something beyond geology. Professional planetary scientists generally declined to engage with the conspiracy theories, viewing them as a waste of time and a distraction from legitimate research. This created a separation between mainstream academic study of the Moon and the parallel analysis being conducted by amateur researchers. Some scientists did engage, writing articles and giving interviews explaining geological processes and the psychology of pattern recognition. They emphasized that skepticism was appropriate, but should be applied equally to all claims. Extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and photographs of geometric-looking formations were not extraordinary evidence of artificial structures. What neither side could definitively prove was intentionality. Natural processes could create apparently artificial patterns. Impact ejecta could land in organised arrangements. Fault lines could be remarkably straight. Volcanic features could produce geometric shapes. But the question was whether that's what actually happened, or whether scientists were forcing natural explanations onto data that actually represented something else. This was the fundamental impasse. Without being able to visit these formations directly, to examine them up close, to analyse their composition and structure in detail, determining their true nature was impossible. Remote sensing had limits. Photographs could be interpreted multiple ways. Indirect evidence could support multiple conclusions. What was needed was direct investigation. Boots on the ground, or at least rovers capable of detailed analysis. But NASA's plans for future lunar exploration focused primarily on the near side, particularly the South Pole where water ice deposits offered potential resources for future bases. The far side remained a lower priority. China, however, had different plans. By the late 2010s, China's space program had made remarkable progress. They had landed missions on the near side, developed heavy-lift launch vehicles, and established a sophisticated space infrastructure that rivaled NASA's capabilities. And they had turned their attention to the far side, not with orbital missions or remote sensing, but with a landing mission designed to put instruments directly on the far side surface. This mission would change the far side debate in fundamental ways, because one of the world's superpowers was about to do something unprecedented, something that would demonstrate capabilities and ambitions that suggested the moon was becoming a contested territory rather than a shared scientific resource, and they were going to do it with remarkably little advance notice to the international community. Chapter 7. The Strategic Value of Silence. Before we discuss what happened in the late 2010s, we need to understand why the far side of the moon has strategic value beyond simple geological curiosity. The far side is unique in our solar system. It's the only substantial body that is completely radio shielded from Earth by another massive object. When you're on the far side, our planet is literally blocked from view, hidden behind thousands of kilometers of lunar rock. Every radio transmission from Earth, every satellite signal, every bit of electromagnetic noise generated by our civilization is filtered out by that barrier. For radio astronomers, this is paradise. Earth's electromagnetic environment is incredibly noisy. Our civilization generates constant radio interference across virtually the entire spectrum. Cell towers pump out signals 24 hours a day. Satellites transmit television broadcasts, GPS signals, and communications data. Television and radio stations fill specific frequencies with programming. Radar systems sweep the sky continuously. Wi-Fi networks blanket populated areas. All of this creates a background noise that makes detecting faint cosmic signals nearly impossible from Earth's surface. Even radio telescopes in remote locations, far from cities and infrastructure, still operate in a contaminated electromagnetic environment. Techniques exist to filter out known interference sources. Software can subtract expected patterns. Observations can be timed to avoid passing satellites. But the noise floor is still enormously higher than it would be in a truly quiet environment. The far side of the moon offers perfect radio silence. No signals from Earth. No satellites overhead. No interference from human technology whatsoever. A telescope placed there could detect signals that would be completely invisible from Earth. It could listen to the faint whispers of the early universe, radiation from the cosmic dawn when the first stars ignited. It could detect exoplanet atmospheres through their radio emissions. It could potentially even detect artificial signals from other technological civilizations, if any exist in our galactic neighborhood. This has been understood since the early days of radio astronomy. Scientists have proposed far-side telescope arrays for decades. The scientific benefits would be revolutionary, opening entirely new windows on cosmic phenomena currently hidden by terrestrial interference. But there's another implication of that radio silence, one that has nothing to do with astronomy. If you wanted to conduct communications or surveillance operations that were completely undetectable from Earth, the far side of the moon would be the perfect location. You could operate transmitters, receivers, and data processing systems without any risk of monitoring from Earth-based facilities. Every transmission would be shielded by the moon itself. Every operation would be invisible to observation. During the Cold War, this strategic possibility was not lost on either superpower. Both the Soviet Union and the United States studied the feasibility of establishing far-side installations. Military planners considered the benefits of having communication relay stations that couldn't be jammed or monitored by adversaries. The technical challenges were enormous, particularly the need for relay satellites to maintain communication with Earth. Any far-side installation would be cut off from direct communication, requiring at least one satellite positioned where it could see both Earth and the far side simultaneously. The Soviets seriously considered this in the 1960s and 70s. proposing automated relay stations that could support military communications while remaining invisible to American monitoring. The Americans conducted similar studies, evaluating far-side locations for signals, intelligence operations. Nothing was built. The technical challenges were too great with the technology available at the time, the costs were astronomical, and as the Cold War ended, priorities shifted to other domains. But in recent years, interest in far-side infrastructure has resurged, and this time, it's not theoretical. Multiple nations have announced plans for permanent far-side facilities. NASA has discussed potential locations for future bases as part of its Artemis program, which aims to establish sustained lunar presence. The European Space Agency has proposed collaborative projects involving far-side observations and potential installations. Russia, now operating with less resources than the Soviet Union commanded but still ambitious in space exploration, has outlined construction timelines for far-side facilities in partnership with other nations. But it was China that moved first. The Chinese space program, operating with less public scrutiny and more centralized decision-making than Western agencies, had been quietly developing far-side capabilities for years. They launched relay satellites, positioning them at gravitationally stable points where they could maintain constant contact with both Earth and the far side. They conducted detailed orbital surveys, mapping potential landing sites and analysing terrain for suitability. They identified specific regions of interest, though what made those regions interesting was never publicly explained in detail. And then, with relatively little advance notice to the international community, they landed a spacecraft on the far side. This was in early 2019. The mission was called Chang'e 4. It successfully touched down in the von Karman crater, a large impact basin within the even larger South Pole Aitken Basin, making China the first and only nation to achieve a soft landing on the lunar far side. The mission carried scientific instruments, including a radio telescope designed to conduct astronomical observations from the uniquely quiet environment. China presented this as a purely scientific endeavour, a contribution to human knowledge about the universe. International scientific organisations congratulated China on the achievement. Papers were published describing the mission's findings. The radio astronomy data was shared with international collaborators, but the strategic implications were impossible to ignore. By establishing a far-side presence, China had demonstrated technological capabilities that matched or exceeded those of NASA. They had proven they could maintain communications with a far-side facility through relay satellites, solving the technical challenge that had prevented earlier missions. They had created infrastructure that could potentially be expanded into a permanent installation. The Chang'e 4 lander and its accompanying rover were designed for extended operations, not just a brief demonstration. Most importantly, they had done it in a region that was effectively unobservable from Earth. The international response was muted in ways that suggested careful diplomatic consideration. NASA issued a statement acknowledging the achievement and expressing hope for international cooperation in future lunar exploration. The European Space Agency offered congratulations. Russia praised the mission as advancing scientific knowledge. But there was an underlying tension, a recognition that the rules of space exploration had shifted. Because here's what nobody said publicly. If China could land scientific instruments on the far side, they could land anything on the far side. Communications equipment, surveillance systems, research facilities whose true purpose remained classified. Even, theoretically, military assets, though the Outer Space Treaty prohibited such deployment. And nobody on Earth would ever know exactly what was there. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't Cold War thinking inappropriately applied to modern cooperation. It was the inevitable logic of the far side's geography. Radio silence works both ways. It protects astronomical observations from Earth's interference, but it also shields whatever activities might be occurring there from Earth's observation. Any nation operating on the far side has complete information control. They decide what data to share. They determine what observations to release. They control the narrative about what they're doing and why. This creates strategic advantage regardless of what's actually being done. Even if operations are entirely peaceful and scientific, the perception of hidden capabilities creates leverage. Western space agencies began accelerating their own far-side plans. What had been long-term proposals discussed in planning documents and scientific conferences suddenly became near-term priorities with allocated funding. NASA announced partnerships with commercial space companies to develop far-side missions. International collaborations were formed, bringing together European, Japanese and Canadian agencies. Funding requests to government legislatures emphasised the strategic importance of lunar presence. The race for the far side had begun. But unlike the original space race of the 1960s, this one wasn't primarily about prestige or proving technological superiority. This one was about control, about establishing presence in a location that was, by its very nature, hidden from scrutiny, about ensuring that no single nation dominated access to the most strategically valuable real estate in the solar system. And some researchers began asking a different question. Why now? Why? After decades of proposals and studies and occasional missions, were multiple nations suddenly treating far-side infrastructure as an urgent priority? Was it simply the natural progression of space exploration? Technology had finally made far-side operations feasible and cost-effective. Commercial launch systems were reducing costs. International cooperation made ambitious projects possible. All of that was true, but it didn't fully explain the urgency. Or had something changed? Had some new information emerged that made the far side strategically critical in ways beyond radio astronomy and communications relay? The official answer was that technology and reduced costs had made far side operations practical for the first time. Space agencies emphasized scientific benefits, particularly the unique environment for radio observations free from terrestrial interference. The real answer might be more complex, because if there was something on the far side, something discovered during earlier missions but kept classified, then establishing a permanent presence there wouldn't primarily be about astronomy or geological research. It would be about control, about investigation, about ensuring that whatever was there remained under human supervision and study, or perhaps about ensuring that whatever was there remained undiscovered by the public while governments determined how to handle the information. The strategic value of the far side, then, wouldn't just be its radio silence or its concealment from Earth-based observation. It would be whatever was already there, waiting to be fully understood. Chapter 8. Chang'e 4 and the Questions. Nobody asked. The Chang'e 4 landing should have been a massive international story. The first spacecraft on the far side of the moon. A historic achievement. Front-page news across the globe. It wasn't. Coverage was limited, technical and brief. Most major news outlets ran short pieces acknowledging the landing, then moved on to other topics within a day or two. The scientific community offered congratulations but seemed strangely restrained in their enthusiasm. This muted response was curious for several reasons. When China had landed Chang'e 3 on the near side in 2013, there had been significantly more international attention. That mission had been celebrated as a major step in China's space program, marking their arrival as a serious player in lunar exploration. Western media had covered it extensively, analysing what it meant for the future of space exploration and discussing the growing capabilities of China's space program. But Chang'e 4, the more technically challenging and historically significant mission, received far less fanfare. Some observers suggested this was political. Western media downplaying a Chinese achievement to avoid giving credit to a geopolitical rival. That explanation had some validity, particularly given the increasingly tense relationship between China and Western nations over trade, technology, and international influence. But it didn't account for the scientific community's restrained response. Scientists generally celebrate achievements regardless of national origin. Major discoveries and technical accomplishments are recognised because they advance human knowledge, not because of who achieved them. The first detection of gravitational waves was celebrated globally, even though it was primarily an American achievement. The discovery of the Higgs boson at CERN brought international acclaim despite being a European project. Science transcends national boundaries in ways that politics often doesn't. Yet the reaction to Chang'e 4 from planetary scientists, from space agencies in other countries, from the broader international community of researchers was oddly subdued. It was as if the landing confirmed something rather than discovered something. As if people who knew what to expect were simply checking off a milestone rather than witnessing something new. China released data and images from the mission through established scientific channels. The terrain looked as expected based on orbital observations. The instruments functioned correctly, gathering data on composition, radiation environment, and other parameters. The relay satellite, positioned at a Lagrange point where gravitational forces from Earth and Moon balanced, maintained communications flawlessly. Signals travelled from the lander to the satellite, then from the satellite to Earth, with minimal delays and excellent data integrity. Everything was proceeding according to plan. But conspiracy researchers noticed something interesting about the Chinese data release schedule. Like NASA, like all space agencies, China's space program was selective about what information was made public and when. Images were released in batches, often weeks after they were captured. Scientific data went through extensive review before publication in academic journals. This was presented as normal scientific procedure. Data needed to be validated, calibrated against known standards, and properly documented before release. Rushing to publish raw data could lead to misinterpretations, false conclusions, and errors that would undermine scientific credibility. All true, all reasonable, all consistent with standard practice across international space agencies. Yet some patterns emerged that seemed unusual, even accounting for normal caution. Certain images from Chang'e 4 showed landscape features that appeared inconsistent with surrounding terrain. Unusual brightness variations that didn't match the expected photometric properties of lunar regolith. Shadows that didn't quite align with the expected solar angles given the known time and location. Small details that amateur analysts poring over every released image flagged as potentially significant. Chinese space officials addressed these observations with the same explanations NASA had used for decades. Lighting effects created illusions. Camera artifacts from sensor noise or compression algorithms produced apparent anomalies. Natural geological variations appeared unusual in photographs, but were perfectly ordinary in context. The explanations were scientifically valid. Every claimed anomaly had a prosaic explanation that fit within, understood physics and geology. But the pattern of anomalies continued, and more intriguing were reports that never made it into official channels. Rumours circulated among space industry personnel, shared in private communications and informal discussions at conferences, about Chinese scientists being surprised by some of the Chang'e 4 data. Not shocked, not witnessing anything that contradicted fundamental understanding of lunar science. Just small discrepancies that didn't quite match expectations. These were second-hand accounts, third-hand in some cases, impossible to verify. Someone knew someone who worked with someone at the Chinese Academy of Sciences who had mentioned that certain measurements were unexpected, but they suggested that something about the far-side environment wasn't matching theoretical models, not dramatically, not obviously, just enough to be noticeable to people who knew what the measurements should show. One persistent rumour involved electromagnetic, readings from the lander's instruments. The background radiation environment was reportedly showing fluctuations that didn't align with solar activity or known sources. Not constant, not regular, but occasional spikes or variations that defied easy explanation. Another rumour mentioned that some of the Chang'e 4 rover's photographs, never publicly released, showed features in nearby terrain that Chinese researchers were still attempting to explain. Natural formations, almost certainly, but with characteristics that didn't quite fit established categories. None of this rose to the level of confirmed fact. No documents were leaked, no whistleblowers came forward with evidence. The claims remained in the realm of unverified speculation, but they aligned with a pattern that had been developing for decades. A pattern of space agencies being more interested in the far side than their public statements suggested. Of careful control over what information reached public awareness. Of scientific findings being processed through multiple layers of review before release. China announced plans for additional far-side missions. Chang'e 5 would focus on sample return from the near side, but future missions would revisit the far side with more advanced instruments. A permanent far-side research station was proposed, with construction potentially beginning within the next decade. International cooperation was invited, with China offering to share resources and coordinate efforts with other space agencies. This was presented as a magnanimous gesture, an attempt to make lunar exploration a global endeavour rather than a national competition. But the offer came with conditions. Partner nations would need to coordinate their activities with Chinese mission control. Data sharing would be negotiated on a case-by-case basis. Access to Chinese far-side infrastructure would be granted according to terms Beijing would determine. In other words, China was establishing itself as the gatekeeper to far-side access. The international response to these announcements was telling. NASA accelerated its own far-side proposals, seeking funding for missions that could operate independently of Chinese infrastructure. Russia began discussing joint missions with China, recognizing that partnership might offer better access than competition. Private space companies, particularly American ones, started offering far-side delivery services to whoever would pay, seeing a business opportunity in nations wanting independent access. Everyone wanted a presence there. This rush seemed disproportionate to the stated scientific benefits. Yes, far-side radio astronomy was valuable. Yes, geological research could advance our understanding of lunar formation and evolution. Yes, the unique environment offered opportunities for certain types of experiments. But the level of investment being proposed, the speed with which plans were being developed, exceeded what those benefits alone would justify, unless there was another reason. Unless the far side offered something beyond scientific discovery, something strategic, something that governments understood but weren't publicly discussing, or perhaps something that had already been discovered but remained classified. By the time Chang'e 4 completed its primary mission and entered extended operations, continuing to function far beyond its designed lifespan, the far side had transformed from an astronomical curiosity into a geopolitical priority. And that transformation happened with surprising speed and remarkable global coordination, almost as if every major space agency had received the same briefing, almost as if they all knew something that justified treating the far side as strategically critical. But what exactly they knew remained carefully unstated. The scientific papers published from Chang'e 4, data focused on composition analysis, radiation measurements, and geological observations, all legitimate science, all contributing to human knowledge. But conspicuously absent from these publications was any discussion of anomalies, unexpected findings, or observations that didn't fit existing models, which could mean there were no such observations, or it could mean they were being handled through other channels that didn't involve public scientific literature and open academic discourse. Chapter 9. The Signal Hypothesis. Among the various conspiracy theories about the far side, one has gained particular traction in recent years. It doesn't claim massive alien bases or crashed spacecraft. It doesn't require believing in impossible secret construction projects or elaborate cover-ups involving thousands of people. It simply suggests that there might be something on the far side that's transmitting a signal. The theory evolved from analysis of the various anomalies we've discussed throughout this investigation. The strange sounds reported by Apollo astronauts during far-side passes, the geometric formations visible in orbital images, the unusual electromagnetic readings hinted at in unverified reports, and most significantly, the coordinated international interest in establishing far-side infrastructure. The hypothesis is straightforward. At some point during lunar observation missions, sensors detected an artificial signal emanating from the far side. Not a message intended for humanity, not an attempt at communication, but rather an automated transmission. Something old. Something that had been broadcasting for a very long time, possibly millions of years. This would explain several puzzling aspects of far-side research that we've examined. First, it would explain why certain data from early missions remained classified far longer than national security concerns would justify. A signal detection would be exactly the kind of discovery that governments would classify immediately. Not because it was dangerous necessarily, but because they needed time to understand it before causing potential public panic or religious upheaval. Second, it would explain the sudden international urgency about far-side infrastructure that emerged in the 2010s. If a signal existed, every major nation would want independent confirmation. They would want their own instruments on the far side, free from reliance on other nations' data or interpretations. The race wouldn't be about claiming territory, which is prohibited by international treaty anyway. It would be about verification, about ensuring your nation had first-hand knowledge rather than depending on what others chose to share. Third, it would explain the restraint in public announcements. If multiple agencies had detected the same signal independently, but couldn't explain its origin or determine its meaning, they would face an impossible communication problem. How do you tell the public that something artificial exists on the moon without knowing what it is, where it came from, how old it is, or what it means? Do you announce it immediately, triggering global speculation and possible panic? Do you wait until you understand more, risking accusations of cover-up if the information leaks? Do you coordinate with other nations first, creating delays and complications? The safest answer, from a bureaucratic perspective, would be to say nothing. At least until you understand more. At least until you can frame the discovery in ways that minimize disruption. The signal hypothesis gained support from an unlikely source, whistleblower testimony. In the early 2020s, a former NASA contractor came forward, claiming to have worked on signal analysis from far-side observations. His name was never widely publicized, and he spoke primarily through intermediary researchers, rather than directly to media. His account was detailed and technically sophisticated. He described detection methodology, frequency ranges, analysis protocols and data processing techniques in ways that suggested genuine familiarity with NASA's operations. According to his testimony, an anomalous signal had been detected by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter during routine radio environment mapping in the late 2010s. The spacecraft carried instruments designed to measure the electromagnetic environment around the Moon, characterizing natural radio emissions and mapping variations in the magnetic field. During a pass over a specific region of the far side, the instruments detected something unexpected. A faint but distinct radio emission that didn't match any natural source. The signal was extremely weak, barely above the detection threshold. It was periodic, repeating with a consistent interval, and it originated from a specific location on the surface, not from space or from any known spacecraft. The contractor claimed that when this detection was reported to senior NASA personnel, an immediate classification was imposed. The data was segregated from routine observations. Analysis was restricted to personnel with appropriate security clearances, and no mention was made in public science releases from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter mission. Further observations were conducted, according to his account, using different instruments and from different orbital positions. The signal remained detectable, consistent in its properties, originating from the same location. Analysis determined it was not interference from spacecraft systems. It was not reflection or scattering from Earth-based transmissions. It was not any known natural phenomenon produced by solar radiation interacting with lunar materials. It appeared to be artificial, generated by technology, modulated in ways that suggested information content, though the modulation scheme was unlike anything in human telecommunications. NASA immediately denied these claims when they began circulating online. The contractor was dismissed as disgruntled, possibly fabricating the story for attention or financial gain from appearances at conferences and in documentaries. No corroborating evidence was provided by the contractor. No documents were leaked. No other personnel came forward to support his account. It remained a single source making extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence. But some details in his testimony were oddly specific and verifiable. He described technical procedures for signal processing that matched NASA's known methods. He mentioned specific dates for orbital passes that aligned with known Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter activities. He discussed internal organizational structures and communication protocols in ways that suggested insider knowledge. Most importantly, he claimed that the signal had characteristics suggesting it wasn't natural. It showed amplitude modulation patterns. It had spectral structure indicating intentional frequency selection, and it appeared to be repeating with a period that didn't match any known astronomical or geological cycle. If true, this would be the most significant discovery in human history. Proof that artificial constructs existed beyond Earth, created by non-human intelligence, evidence that we weren't alone in the universe, or at least that we hadn't been alone in the past, but proof was precisely what was lacking. The contractor provided no documents, no recordings, no data files, no physical evidence of any kind. His claims rested entirely on personal testimony, and while his technical knowledge seemed legitimate, that didn't prove his specific claims about signal detection were accurate. He could have worked on signal processing for NASA, giving him authentic knowledge of procedures, while fabricating the story about an anomalous detection. Alternatively, he could be misremembering or misinterpreting events from years earlier, conflating routine detections of interference with something more exotic. Or, of course, he could be telling the truth about something that actually happened, but was successfully kept classified. The story faded from mainstream attention after the initial wave of interest. News cycles moved on. The contractor gave a few more interviews, then largely disappeared from public view. But in conspiracy research communities, the signal hypothesis became the dominant explanation for far-side secrecy. It fit the pattern of evidence better than other theories. It didn't require believing in massive construction projects that would leave obvious traces. It didn't depend on crashed spacecraft or alien bases that should be visible in high-resolution images. It only required accepting that automated technology, far older than human civilization, might exist in our solar system, that some ancient intelligence had placed monitoring equipment or navigational beacons or scientific instruments on the moon, and they were still functioning millions or billions of years later. This was actually more plausible than many alternatives. Physics allowed for such longevity. Engineering could achieve it. We ourselves were building spacecraft designed to function for centuries, sending probes beyond the solar system that would operate long after human civilization might have fallen. If we could do it with primitive 21st century technology, what might a truly advanced civilization achieve? The hypothesis suggested that the signal wasn't a message directed at Earth. It was more like a beacon, an automated system performing some function, broadcasting into space, perhaps for millions of years, waiting for something. Or perhaps simply transmitting because that's what it was designed to do, long after its creators disappeared from the universe. This would explain why there was no obvious attempt at communication. This signal wasn't trying to contact us. We happened to develop the technology to detect it, but it wasn't intended for us specifically. Some versions of the theory went further, suggesting the signal might be a coordinate marker. Wei-Chi, a reference point for navigation. Something that would allow its creators to locate our moon from vast distances across interstellar or even intergalactic space. Advanced civilizations might seed galaxies with such beacons, creating a navigation network that persisted across cosmic timescales. Our moon might simply be one node in a vast system we were only beginning to detect. Others proposed it might be a monitoring station. Automated sensors watching for signs of technological civilization, designed to activate or transmit specific messages when intelligent life emerged on nearby planets. Maybe it had been silent for billions of years, waiting patiently, and only began transmitting when Earth's electromagnetic emissions indicated we had developed radio technology. These elaborations were purely speculative, extending beyond any evidence into imaginative scenarios. But the core signal hypothesis remained frustratingly plausible. It explained the known facts without requiring impossible claims. It accounted for government secrecy without demanding massive conspiracies. It suggested a discovery that would justify classification without requiring malicious intent or cover-up. And most disturbingly, it suggested that we might be living in a universe where ancient technology outlives its creators, continuing to function long after the civilizations that built it have vanished into cosmic history. The question wasn't whether such technology could exist. Physics permitted it. Engineering could achieve it. The question was whether it actually did exist on the far side of our moon, and whether the recent race to establish permanent far-side infrastructure was really about astronomy and geological research, or about investigating something that had already been found but wasn't yet understood, something that governments had decided the public wasn't ready to know about, at least not yet. Chapter 10. The Logic of Silence. Let's engage in a thought experiment. Assume, for the sake of argument, that something artificial exists on the far side of the moon, not necessarily a signal broadcasting into space, not necessarily any specific thing, just something that can't be explained through natural geological processes. How would governments respond? The instinctive assumption might be immediate public disclosure. A discovery of that magnitude would be impossible to keep secret, the reasoning goes. Too many people would be involved. Too many nations would have independent confirmation. Someone would leak the information. But that assumption might be wrong, and understanding why requires thinking through the actual decision-making process that would occur. Consider what would happen if multiple space agencies independently detected something artificial on the far side. Each would immediately classify the finding, not because of malicious intent or desire to deceive the public, but because that's standard protocol for significant national security information. Anything unprecedented, anything with potential strategic implications, gets classified automatically while assessment occurs. Each agency would then face a critical decision: confirm with other agencies or investigate independently. Confirmation would require sharing classified data across international boundaries. It would mean admitting the discovery to geopolitical rivals. It would create immediate pressure for coordinated public disclosure before any single nation fully understood what they'd found. Independent investigation would allow each nation to control the narrative, to develop their own understanding before sharing information. But it would also create a prisoner's dilemma situation. Everyone knows the others probably detected the same thing, but nobody wants to be the first to publicly acknowledge it. Nobody wants to create global panic or disruption before understanding the full implications. The rational choice from each individual nation's perspective becomes coordinated silence. Not through explicit conspiracy or formal agreement, but through parallel decision-making by independent bureaucracies all following the same logic. Don't disclose until you understand. Don't admit what you know until others do. Don't create public upheaval over something you can't fully explain. This would explain several observable patterns in how space agencies have behaved regarding the far side. It would explain why multiple nations are racing to establish far-side infrastructure without clearly articulating why it's suddenly so urgent. They're all trying to get their own assets in position to investigate, without revealing that there's something specific to investigate. Each agency can claim they're pursuing normal scientific research, studying the unique environment, establishing presence for future exploration. All true statements that don't reveal the underlying motivation. It would explain the muted public response to significant far-side missions like Chang'e 4. If space agencies know there's something genuinely important about the far side, celebrating each mission becomes awkward. Too much enthusiasm might prompt journalists to ask questions about why this particular region is receiving so much attention. Better to downplay significance, treat each mission as routine, avoid drawing attention to patterns. It would explain the careful curation of data releases we've discussed. Images and measurements would be reviewed not just for scientific accuracy, but for what they might inadvertently reveal. Anything ambiguous would be withheld pending further analysis. Anything that might generate public questions would be classified. Better to control information flow than deal with premature disclosure. Most importantly, it would explain why there's been no explicit denial of far-side anomalies despite widespread public speculation. NASA and other agencies could easily make definitive statements. We have thoroughly investigated the far side and found no evidence of artificial structures, signals, or anything that cannot be explained through natural processes. They don't say this. They address specific claims individually, debunking particular photographs or refuting specific allegations, but they never make broad categorical denials about the entire far side. The absence of such denials is telling. It suggests agencies are being carefully literal in their public statements, addressing the specific evidence people present without making claims that might later prove false if the situation develops. This is standard bureaucratic behaviour when dealing with uncertain situations. Say nothing that might need to be retracted. Acknowledge nothing that isn't already public. Wait for better information before committing to any position. In legal terminology, it's avoiding making affirmative misrepresentations, while also not confirming anything you're not required to confirm. But this cautious approach has consequences. The longer silence is maintained, the more suspicious it appears. The more carefully agencies curate information, the more people assume there's something being hidden. Conspiracy theories proliferate in information vacuums, growing more elaborate in the absence of authoritative explanation. Yet disclosure would create its own severe problems. Imagine the scenario. A major space agency announces that something artificial has been detected on the moon. Not a major installation or obvious structure, but an anomalous signal or formation that cannot be explained through natural processes. They emphasize that there's no immediate threat, no indication of current alien presence, no contact of any kind, just evidence that something artificial exists on the far side. What happens next? The public reaction would be unpredictable and potentially severe. Some people would be fascinated, excited by confirmation that we're not alone or weren't always alone. Others would panic, assuming that alien technology on the moon represents an existential threat. Religious institutions would face immediate theological crises. Most major religions have cosmologies that don't account for other intelligent life in the universe. Some could adapt their teachings relatively easily. Others would face fundamental contradictions with core beliefs. The economic impact would be significant. Markets hate uncertainty. An announcement like this would create maximum uncertainty. Stock markets could crash as investors fled to safety, or they could surge as people bet on technology companies and space exploration firms. Scientific institutions would face enormous pressure to provide explanations they couldn't deliver. If space agencies themselves didn't understand what was detected, how could scientists explain it to the public? The admission of not knowing would undermine confidence in scientific expertise. Geopolitically, it would trigger an immediate race to control whatever was discovered. Every nation with space capabilities would demand access to investigation. International law about the moon explicitly prohibits claiming territory, but that framework was created assuming the moon was geologically dead and empty. An artificial artifact would create unprecedented legal complications. Who has the right to study it? Who determines what should be done with information gained from it? What if it contains technology that could be reverse engineered? Defense planners would immediately start asking whether the artifact represents any threat. Could it be a weapon? A monitoring system reporting on human activities? A quarantine mechanism preventing us from expanding beyond Earth? Even if there was no evidence of threat, the mere existence of unknown technology would force military strategists to consider worst-case scenarios. All of this would happen before anyone actually understood what was discovered, or whether it had any significance beyond simply existing. Rational. Calculation becomes clear. Silence is stable until understanding is achieved. Once you know what it is, where it came from, how it functions, and whether it poses any implications for humanity, then you can craft a message that creates the appropriate response. But premature disclosure creates chaos without benefit, panic without information, disruption without corresponding gain. This logic becomes even more compelling when you consider historical examples of governments successfully keeping secrets. The Manhattan Project developed atomic weapons with thousands of people involved, and the Soviet Union didn't know about it until the bombs were used. Stealth aircraft programs remained classified for years despite hundreds of personnel and obvious gaps in military capability accounting. Intelligence programs have maintained secrecy for decades. Encryption methods, surveillance capabilities, operational techniques, all kept classified far beyond what seemed possible, not perfectly, not without leaks, but sufficiently to prevent broad public awareness during critical periods. A far-side discovery would have similar motivation for classification. The stakes would be high enough to justify extraordinary secrecy measures. The number of people with direct knowledge could be kept relatively small through compartmentalization, and international coordination, while imperfect, could be achieved through informal channels without formal agreements that might leak. Senior officials from different space agencies meet regularly at international conferences. They establish personal relationships. They understand each other's constraints and capabilities. They can coordinate without creating paper trails or formal treaties. A quiet agreement to maintain silence while investigation proceeds wouldn't require conspiracy. Just mutual recognition that disclosure serves neither nation's interests until more is understood. The result would be exactly what we observe. Widespread, speculation without confirmation, coordinated silence without explicit coordination, and an unexplained urgency about far-side access that doesn't quite match the stated justifications. Whether this scenario is actually occurring remains unknown to those of us outside classified channels, but it represents a plausible explanation for the patterns we've examined. More plausible, perhaps, than assuming the far side is entirely ordinary, yet somehow generating this level of classified interest and international competition. The silence might not indicate conspiracy, it might simply indicate prudence, caution about revealing something that isn't yet understood, with implications that haven't been fully assessed. If that's the case, the question becomes, how long can silence be maintained? How long before someone leaks concrete evidence? How long before amateur researchers detect something independently? How long before the growing international presence on the far side makes secrecy impossible? And most critically, what will happen when the truth, whatever it is, finally becomes public? Epilogue: the face that watches back. We began this journey by noting something fundamental and unsettling about our nearest celestial neighbour. The moon always shows us the same face, the same craters we've named and mapped, the same Maria that ancient humans saw as a face, or a rabbit, or whatever their culture projected onto those dark patterns. The same familiar features we've watched since our species first looked up at the night sky. But the moon has another face, one that never looks at Earth, one that remained hidden from human eyes until we developed the technology to venture beyond our planet's horizon. And when we finally saw it, in those grainy photographs from Luna 3 in the late 1950s, we found a landscape that didn't match our expectations. Darker, more heavily cratered, subtly different in ways that planetary scientists still debate and analyse. We've explored the history of far-side observation across decades of space exploration. The early Soviet photographs that first revealed the hidden hemisphere, the Apollo missions that orbited the moon, with astronauts reporting unsettling experiences during passes over the far side, the unexplained sounds heard by Apollo 10's crew, documented in official recordings yet dismissed as radio interference, the ambiguous formations visible in high-resolution orbital images, geometric patterns that might be natural but seem statistically unlikely, the sudden international urgency to establish permanent infrastructure on the far side that emerged in the 2010s, with China landing Chang'e 4 and multiple nations accelerating their plans for far-side facilities. We've examined various explanations for these patterns, natural geological processes that can create apparently artificial features, psychological effects of isolation and unfamiliar environments, pareidolia and pattern recognition, leading us to see organisation in random formations, all scientifically valid, all capable of explaining individual anomalies and observations. But cumulatively, the pattern suggests something more complex than simple misinterpretation or overactive imaginations. The far side represents unique strategic value that we've explored in detail: perfect radio silence for astronomical observations, complete concealment from Earth-based monitoring, an ideal location for sensitive research, communications relay, or surveillance operations. It also represents something more abstract and perhaps more significant: a boundary, a limit to what we can casually observe from our own planet, a region that requires deliberate effort and significant resources to investigate. And in that boundary exists the possibility that something remains undiscovered, not because it's impossible to find or because our technology is inadequate, but because those who found it chose not to disclose it. At least not yet. The signal hypothesis we've examined offers one possible explanation: automated technology, ancient beyond human comprehension, still functioning on the lunar surface, broadcasting, waiting, performing whatever task it was designed to accomplish millions or billions of years ago. But whether that specific hypothesis is accurate matters less than what it represents. It represents the acknowledgement that we might not be the first technological civilization to reach our moon, that the solar system might contain remnants of intelligence that predates humanity by unimaginable spans of time, that discovering such remnants would simultaneously be the most significant finding in human history, and potentially the most carefully guarded secret any government could possess. The far side of the moon remains largely unexplored despite decades of observation. Yes, we have orbital imagery covering every square kilometre. Yes, China's Chang'e 4 has operated on the surface for years, but vast regions have never been examined up close, craters remain unvisited, formations remain unanalysed except through remote sensing. The resolution of our best images, while impressive, still leaves enormous room for small features to remain hidden. In the coming years and decades, that will change. Multiple nations are planning permanent installations with specific timelines and allocated funding. Infrastructure is being developed. International partnerships are forming. Within a generation, humans might live and work on the far side, conducting research in the perfect silence that lunar geology and cosmic positioning provide. What they find there will depend on what actually exists. Perhaps they'll find only natural wonders, complex geology revealing the moon's formation and evolution, scientific opportunities for astronomy and physics, strategic advantages for communications and observation. Or perhaps they'll find something else. Perhaps they'll find proof that we're not alone in the universe, even if that proof comes not through contact with living beings, but through discovery of our ancient technology still performing its programmed functions long after its creators vanished from existence. Perhaps they'll find that the far side has been waiting, not actively, not consciously, but simply existing in its hidden state, preserved by the accident of orbital mechanics that keeps it forever turned away from Earth. And perhaps, when we finally look closely enough with sufficient resources and determination, we'll understand why those who looked first chose to remain silent about what they saw. Because some discoveries are too significant to announce casually without preparation and context. Some questions are too important to answer before understanding the implications. Some truths require careful consideration before revelation, and some secrets are kept not to deceive the public, but to protect them, to buy time for understanding, to allow assessment before disclosure creates irreversible consequences. The moon has shown us one face for all of human history. We've mapped it, named its features, walked on its surface, planted flags and left equipment and brought back samples. That face is familiar, safe, understood. Part of human consciousness and cultural heritage across every civilization that has watched it wax and wane through monthly cycles. But the other face, the one that never looks at Earth, remains mysterious despite our reconnaissance and our missions and our growing understanding. And in that enduring mystery exists the possibility that we've been watched longer than we've been watching, not by malevolent beings or hostile intelligence, not by conscious observation or active monitoring, but by the mechanical persistence of technology that continues its programmed functions long after purpose and meaning have been forgotten by whatever created it. The far side of the moon is no longer completely hidden from us. We have the technology to see it, to visit it, to establish permanent presence there. Within our lifetimes, it may become as familiar to humans as the near side has been throughout history. The question is whether we're ready for what we might find, or what might have been there all along, waiting in perfect silence on the side of the moon that never faces home, waiting not for us specifically, but simply waiting, broadcasting or functioning or existing according to ancient programming that predates human civilization. And if we find such technology, if we confirm that something artificial exists on our moon, then every assumption about our place in the universe will require revision. We'll have to accept that Earth wasn't the first world in this solar system to develop intelligence, or that intelligence from beyond visited here long ago and left markers of their presence. We'll have to grapple with the reality that the cosmos is not empty, even if it seems empty in our local region in our particular time. We'll have to understand ourselves as latecomers to a universe that has hosted countless other civilizations across billions of years of cosmic history. And we'll have to confront the sobering possibility that those other civilizations are gone. That intelligence emerges, builds, explores, and then vanishes, leaving only silent artifacts behind. But perhaps that confrontation is exactly what we need. Perhaps understanding our place in the vast sweep of cosmic time will give us perspective on our own civilization's challenges and trajectory. Perhaps discovering we're not the first will help ensure we're not the last. The moon waits above us every night, one face familiar, one face hidden. And on that hidden face something might be waiting too. We'll find out soon enough. The race to the far side has begun, and this time we're not just observing from orbit. This time we're going to stay. Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps the channel more than you possibly know, and we deeply appreciate your support. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. We love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, but only if you want to share. Now, let's begin. Imagine for a moment that humanity's greatest mistake wasn't reaching too far into space, but looking too deep into our own oceans. Imagine that beneath miles of dark water, something was found that was never meant to be disturbed. Something ancient, something aware, something that had been watching us long before we ever thought to watch the stars. In 1978, a NASA contractor recorded 18 minutes of footage that would never be shown to the public. 3 weeks later, he was dead. Within a year, NASA abandoned all ocean exploration and never gave a real explanation why. This is not a story about what might be out there in space. This is a story about what we found down here, and why someone decided we should never look again. This is the story of why NASA really left the ocean. The Abyss Protocol, why NASA really left the ocean. July 1978. The Pacific Basin stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface calm under a blanket of stars. The research vessel Pacific Surveyor rolled gently in the swell, its deck lights the only human presence for 300 miles in any direction. But 12,000 feet below, in a world of crushing pressure and absolute darkness, something impossible was about to be recorded. Marvin Elridge had been working with NASA contractors for nearly 6 years. His specialty was deep scanning sonar technology, the kind that could map the ocean floor with unprecedented detail. At 42 years old, Marvin was methodical, careful, and deeply skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured and verified. He had 2 daughters in college, a mortgage in San Diego, and absolutely no patience for speculation or wild theories. He dealt in data, numbers, provable facts. On this particular night, Marvin was aboard the Pacific Surveyor conducting what should have been routine scans as part of the NOAA and NASA Joint Ocean Floor Imaging Program. The mission parameters were straightforward: map a 60 square mile section of seafloor, catalogue any geological features of interest, collect core samples if time permitted. Routine, standard, boring even. He had been on deck drinking coffee, looking at the stars and thinking about whether his oldest daughter would actually finish her engineering degree when the sonar operator called him over around 11:30. The young technician's voice had an edge to it that made Marvin put down his coffee cup and head inside immediately. The screen showed something that shouldn't exist at that depth. Right angles, perfect 90-degree geometry. At 12,000 feet below sea level, nature doesn't create right angles. Erosion, pressure and time smooth everything into curves and irregular shapes. Coral builds organically. Lava flows and hardens in chaotic patterns. Rock fractures along stress lines that are never perfectly perpendicular. But there it was on the display, clear as day. A structure. Marvin ordered the submersible to make another pass. The automated system descended slowly, its lights cutting through the darkness in narrow cones that revealed only small sections of the vast emptiness. This time, they picked up something else. Metal reflections. The sonar was bouncing back signatures consistent with manufactured materials. Not rock, not biological matter. Metal, beneath more than 2 miles of ocean water. The technician adjusted the frequency range, trying to get a clearer reading. "Sir, this doesn't make sense. The return signature is too clean. It's like scanning a building, not a geological formation." Marvin watched the screen, his engineering mind trying to find a rational explanation. A sunken ship, maybe. Except ships don't sink in geometric patterns. They don't end up perfectly aligned on the seafloor, and they don't extend for over half a mile in each direction. Then the readings went wild. Something massive was moving beneath the sediment, not swimming through the water above it, moving beneath it, displacing tons of seafloor material as it shifted position. The displacement calculations appeared on the secondary screen, and Marvin felt his mouth go dry. Whatever was moving down there was at least 800 feet long. The mass estimate kept climbing as the computer tried to calculate volume and density. The submersible's cameras captured only darkness and swirling sediment, but the sonar painted a picture of something vast and deliberately hidden. The object was rising, not quickly, but steadily, pushing up through layers of silt that had probably accumulated over thousands of years. "Pull it back," Marvin said quietly. "Bring the sub up. Now." But before the operator could execute the command, every instrument aboard the submersible simultaneously failed. The video feed cut to static. The sonar went dark. The navigation system stopped transmitting. Even the backup systems, designed to function independently, all died at exactly the same instant. The control room fell silent except for the hum of the ship's generators. Marvin stared at the blank screens, his heart pounding. In 6 years of deep ocean work, he had never seen a total system failure like this. Equipment broke down, sensors malfunctioned, but everything at once. That didn't happen by accident. They waited. 3 hours of running emergency protocols, trying to re-establish contact with the submersible, calculating drift patterns, and preparing the backup recovery system. When they finally retrieved the sub just after 3 a.m, Marvin was the first one to examine it. The exterior showed signs of exposure to an electromagnetic pulse. Scorch marks on the sensor housings. The camera lenses had a strange crystalline pattern etched into them, like they had been exposed to intense magnetic fields. The recording equipment was completely fried, every circuit board melted into useless slag. But Marvin had already seen enough. He had watched the readings in real time. He knew what was down there, even if he couldn't prove it anymore. The official report, filed 2 weeks later, contained exactly 4 words about the incident. Seafloor anomaly, equipment malfunction. Nothing about the geometry, nothing about the metal signatures, nothing about the massive moving object, just equipment malfunction. Marvin read the report 3 times, each time feeling more certain that someone was actively burying what they had found. He had submitted a detailed account. 12 pages of technical observations, sonar readings, equipment analysis, and recommendations for follow-up investigation. All of it reduced to 4 words in the final document. Marvin Elridge wasn't the type to let things go. He started making calls, reaching out to colleagues at other oceanographic institutions, contacting journalists who had covered scientific discoveries before. He was careful about it, or at least he thought he was. He never mentioned aliens or conspiracy theories. He just talked about anomalous readings that deserved further study. He used technical language. He cited data. But someone was listening to those calls. Someone was reading those emails. And someone decided that Marvin Elridge was becoming a problem. 3 weeks after he started making noise, Marvin died in a single car accident on Interstate 5, just north of San Diego. It was a clear Tuesday morning. No rain, no fog, excellent visibility. Traffic was light. According to witnesses, his car had been travelling normally in the right lane when it suddenly accelerated, veered across 3 lanes of traffic, and crashed into the centre divider at over 90 miles per hour. The police report called it mechanical failure. The accident investigation found that his brake lines had corroded through completely. Strange, the investigator noted in his report, because the vehicle had passed a safety inspection just 1 month earlier with no issues noted. Strange too that all 4 brake lines had corroded in exactly the same way, at exactly the same rate, as if someone had deliberately weakened them with chemicals designed to fail after a specific period of time. But those observations stayed in the investigator's notes and never made it into the official conclusion. Mechanical failure, accidental death, case closed. Marvin's wife received his life insurance payout without any problems. His daughters finished college. His name appeared in a few professional journals as a contributor to oceanic research. And then he was forgotten, just another scientist who had devoted his career to expanding human knowledge and died too young in an unfortunate accident. Within a year, NASA quietly ended all deep ocean involvement. No press conference, no explanation. The agency that had spent nearly 2 decades exploring Earth's oceans simply walked away. The public never learned why. But the message to anyone else who might have been thinking about speaking up was crystal clear. Some discoveries are not meant to be shared, but the truth was buried in classified documents, suppressed testimonies, and deleted records. And it begins with a history that most people have completely forgotten. When NASA was founded on July 29, 1958, the agency's charter contained language that would surprise most Americans today. The Space Act, the founding legislation, specifically stated that NASA's purpose included expansion of human knowledge of phenomena in the atmosphere and space, and critically a preservation of the role of the United States as a leader in aeronautical and space science and technology, and in the application thereof to the conduct of peaceful activities within and outside the atmosphere. But there was another clause, often overlooked in modern discussions, that explicitly mentioned oceanic research as part of the agency's environmental studies mandate. This wasn't a secondary mission added later. Ocean exploration was written directly into NASA's founding purpose, right alongside space exploration. The reasoning was sound. If NASA wanted to understand how life might exist on other planets, they needed to study the most extreme environments on Earth, and nothing on Earth compares to the deep ocean. Crushing pressure, no light, extreme cold or extreme heat near thermal vents, toxic chemistry. If life could exist in those conditions, it could theoretically exist anywhere in the solar system. Throughout the early 1960s and into the 1970s, NASA and NOAA worked hand in hand. They weren't just partners on paper. They were running joint missions into some of the deepest and most unexplored regions on the planet. The Tektite Habitat program put scientists underwater for extended periods, studying the psychological and physiological effects of isolation in extreme environments. The data was meant to prepare for future space stations. NASA developed submersible technology that would later influence the design of spacecraft. They created underwater communication systems that could function under crushing pressure and through miles of water. These same principles would be applied to interplanetary communication. They mapped deep ocean vents that had never been seen by human eyes, discovering ecosystems that survived without sunlight, feeding on chemicals from Earth's interior. The technology NASA created for ocean exploration was genuinely revolutionary. They built robotics meant specifically for underwater environments, not space. These machines could withstand pressures exceeding 16,000 pounds per square inch. They could navigate in complete darkness using advanced sonar arrays that could map terrain in 3 dimensions, and they could go deeper than anyone had gone before. Project Famous, the French-American mid-ocean undersea study, put scientists in submersibles at depths of nearly 9,000 feet to directly observe seafloor spreading along the mid-Atlantic ridge. NASA scientists worked alongside French oceanographers, developing techniques that would later be used for remote planetary exploration. The missions were wildly successful. NASA's ocean programs were discovering new species almost weekly. They were mapping geological formations that changed our understanding of plate tectonics. They were proving that life could exist in conditions we'd previously thought impossible. The funding was solid. The science was groundbreaking. International partnerships were strong. There was every reason to continue and expand these programs. Then, seemingly overnight, everything stopped. By 1980, NASA's ocean projects had completely evaporated. Funding was eliminated across the board. Directives were sealed under classification protocols. Personnel were reassigned or let go. NASA's focus shifted entirely and exclusively to space. The official explanation given to the few people who asked was simple. Budget priorities changed. But that explanation never made sense. NASA's ocean missions were thriving. They were producing results. They were operating within budget. And yet someone, somewhere, made the decision to shut it all down immediately. Not gradually. Not through budget cuts over time. Immediately. The timing was unusual for another reason. This was the same period when deep ocean exploration technology had finally advanced to the point where humanity could access the deepest trenches on Earth. The Mariana Trench, the Tonga Trench, the Puerto Rico Trench, places where the ocean floor drops more than 6 miles below the surface, places where the pressure is over 1,000 times greater than at sea level, places where, until the 1970s, humanity simply couldn't go. But now we could. And then, suddenly, we didn't. Someone forced NASA to abandon the ocean. Someone with enough authority to override the agency's founding mandate. Someone who had seen something in those classified reports that changed everything. Fast forward to 2022. A marine archivist named Lena Hart Boone was working at a federal records facility in Maryland. At 38 years old, Lena had spent her entire adult life around documents. She had a graduate degree in library science and a fascination with maritime history that had started in childhood, growing up in a fishing community on the Carolina coast. Her father had been a commercial fisherman who loved to tell stories about strange things seen far out at sea. Lights beneath the water, sounds that didn't match any known, marine animal, the ocean's mysteries. Most of Lena's colleagues found her job tedious. Endless boxes of faded papers, decades-old reports that nobody would ever read, budget documents and personnel files and meeting minutes from agencies that no longer existed. But Lena loved it. She loved the detective work of piecing together forgotten histories. She loved finding the human stories buried in bureaucratic language. Her job was relatively mundane, cataloguing and digitizing old government documents related to maritime research. Boxes and boxes of forgotten papers, most of it routine bureaucratic material. She worked methodical hours in a climate-controlled room with fluorescent lights and no windows. She brought the same lunch every day, a turkey sandwich and an apple, which she ate while reading whatever document she was currently processing. Her co-workers thought she was quiet, maybe a little obsessive about details, but good at her work. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in March, she opened a box that had been misfiled for decades. It contained materials that should have been in NASA's archives, not buried in a maritime storage facility. The box had been labelled NOAA Personnel Records, 1970 to 1980, and was supposed to contain routine employment documents. But the contents didn't match the label. Inside were technical reports, mission logs, and equipment manifests all bearing NASA identification codes. And buried at the bottom, underneath routine paperwork about supply orders and maintenance schedules, was a handwritten logbook that would change Lena's life forever. The log was labelled Deep Dive 7, Tonga Trench, November 1976, Elridge Team. Lena recognised the name immediately. Marvin Elridge. Over the years, she had come across his name in footnotes and passing references while cataloguing other ocean exploration documents. He had died in a car accident in 1978. Some of the documents she'd seen suggested he had been trying to report unusual findings before his death, but the details were always vague, and most sources dismissed him as someone who had become obsessed with unlikely theories. She set her half-eaten sandwich aside and opened the logbook with the careful reverence she reserved for potentially significant documents. The entries were technical at first. depth readings in precise measurements, sonar configurations with frequency ranges and pulse intervals, equipment checks listing every system by designation number, standard operational material written in the shorthand of someone who had filled out these forms hundreds of times. Depth, 11,100 feet. Water temperature, 34 degrees. Sonar functioning at optimal parameters. Beginning survey grid Alpha 7. But as the dive progressed deeper, the tone changed. Marvin's handwriting became less neat, more hurried. The observations more urgent. The technical language gave way to something more immediate, more human. Metallic echo returns at depth 11,200 feet. Configuration suggests manufactured origin. No known geological explanation. Cross-referencing known shipwrecks in region. Negative for all matches. Requesting second pass for confirmation. Second pass complete. Returns identical. Adding thermal imaging. Thermal signature inconsistent with surrounding seafloor. Object retaining heat at depth, where ambient temperature should be stable. No volcanic activity in this region according to all geological surveys. Unidentifiable vibrations detected. Frequency suggests machinery, not seismic activity. Rhythm is too regular. Pattern repeats every 47 seconds. Equipment functioning normally. All diagnostics green. Readings are accurate. Then came an entry that Lena read 3 times. Her sandwich forgotten, her coffee growing cold beside her. Movement detected beneath sediment layer. Displacement calculations suggest object of immense size. Initial estimate, 800 feet length, possibly larger. Depth of burial suggests object has been here for considerable time, yet movement indicates active state. Too massive and too fast to be biological. Repeat, movement characteristics are too massive and too coordinated to be biological in nature. The next entry was written in a different pen, suggesting Marvin had taken a break and then returned to write what happened next. Emergency protocols initiated. Object began rising towards submersible, not swimming, rising straight up through sediment layers as if pushing through. Debris cloud massive, pressure wave detected by hull sensors, auto ascent engaged at 11:43, sub under extreme stress, hull integrity at 78%. Lost all sensor contact with object at depth 10,000 feet during emergency ascent. All systems experienced simultaneous failure. Electromagnetic pulse consistent with deliberate countermeasure, not natural phenomenon. Recording equipment destroyed. Visual contact impossible due to sediment cloud. Submersible recovered with extensive electromagnetic damage to all electronic components. Then came the final entry, written in block letters, pressed so hard into the page that the pen had nearly torn through the paper. We're not alone down here, and they are listening. Lena sat in the archive room for a long time after reading that. The fluorescent lights hummed above her. In the distance she could hear the muffled sounds of her co-workers moving through the stacks, the quiet routine of the facility continuing around her. But she felt as if something fundamental had shifted. She should have filed the logbook according to protocol and moved on. That was the procedure. Catalogue the material, note any irregularities in a report for her supervisor, and process the next box. But something about this felt too real, too urgent, too deliberately hidden. The handwriting was steady except where urgency had made it rushed. The technical language was precise. This wasn't the work of someone prone to fantasy or exaggeration. This was an engineer documenting observations that terrified him, specifically because they were so clearly measured and verified. Lena looked around the empty archive room. She had worked here for 6 years and had never violated protocol. But she also knew that some documents had a way of disappearing once they entered the classification review process. Important things got buried under bureaucratic procedures all the time. She made copies before returning the original to the box. She told herself she was just being thorough, preserving a potentially significant historical document. Nothing wrong with that. But her hands were shaking slightly as the copier hummed, and she kept glancing toward the door, half expecting someone to walk in and ask what she was doing. Over the next few weeks, Lena began digging deeper. She found a memorandum dated March 1979, stamped with the highest classification markings she had ever seen in maritime archives. The memo was partially redacted, but certain elements were still visible. It was signed by Robert Ballard, the famous deep-sea explorer who would later discover the wreck of the Titanic. It was also signed by Robert Frosch, who was NASA administrator at the time. And there was a third signature line, but the name had been completely blacked out. Not just redacted with a thin line, but covered with heavy black marker, as if someone had been particularly determined to ensure that name never became public. The visible portion of the memo stated, "All oceanic anomaly investigations are to be transferred to a separate classification unit effective immediately. Standard scientific protocols are suspended for designated coordinates pending Department of Defense review." Lena searched every database she had access to. She found no record of NASA ever establishing such a classification unit, at least not publicly. Whatever they had found in the deep ocean, it had been transferred to something beyond normal oversight, something that answered to the military, not civilian science agencies. She needed more information. She needed proof that this wasn't just the paranoid ramblings of one contractor who had seen something he couldn't explain. She needed evidence that the pattern was bigger. She found it in the Navy archives. Through careful requests and legitimate research credentials, Lena gained access to partially declassified Navy sonar logs from the 1970s. These were routine submarine patrol reports that had been sitting in storage for decades. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Position reports, depth readings, contact tracking of other vessels. But scattered throughout the logs were entries that stood out, references to unidentified submerged objects that appeared on sonar and then vanished, reports of sudden accelerations that were physically impossible for any known submarine technology, acoustic shadows that resembled large structural masses but appeared in locations where no structures should exist, and the locations matched: the Tonga Trench, the Puerto Rico Trench, the Mariana Trench, the three deepest places on Earth, the same places where NASA had been conducting their most advanced deep ocean exploration right before they were ordered to stop. The Navy reports used careful language. They never said alien or unknown intelligence. They said things like anomalous contact and unidentified acoustic phenomenon. But the pattern was clear. Something was down there. Multiple Navy vessels had detected it over the course of years, and someone had decided that civilian scientists needed to stop looking. Lena knew she needed to talk to someone who had been there, someone who had worked on NASA's ocean programs, and might be willing to talk about what really happened. She found Harlan Vick living in a retirement community in Florida, in a modest apartment that overlooked a small artificial lake. He had worked as a propulsion engineer for NASA from 1964 until his retirement in 1991. His work had focused on developing systems that could function in extreme environments, both space and ocean. His personnel file, which Lena had accessed through legitimate research channels, showed commendations for innovative solutions to pressure vessel design and deep water propulsion systems. When Lena called him and explained what she had found, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. She could hear him breathing, could almost feel him deciding whether to hang up or engage. Then Harlan said something that made her book a flight to Florida the next day. "I was wondering when someone would finally start asking the right questions. I'm 83 years old. I don't have much time left to worry about classification agreements I signed 40 years ago." They met at a small cafe near his retirement community 3 days later. It was a quiet place, mostly empty in the mid-afternoon between lunch and dinner rushes. Harlan was waiting for her at a corner booth, a lean man with age spots on his hands and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a faded NASA polo shirt that had probably been sitting in his closet since the 90s. He ordered coffee and spent a moment organising his thoughts before speaking, his engineer's mind clearly arranging the information in logical sequence. NASA's interest in the oceans was never really about marine biology or geology, he began, his voice quiet but steady. Those were byproducts. Benefits of the research, certainly, but not the primary goal. What we were really doing was searching for analogue environments, places on Earth that resembled conditions we might find on other planets or moons. The deep ocean has no light. crushing pressure that can exceed 16,000 pounds per square inch, extreme cold except near thermal vents where temperatures can exceed 700 degrees, toxic chemistry, acidic conditions. It's as close to an alien world as you can get without leaving Earth. Lena nodded. This was consistent with what she had read in the public-facing mission statements from that era. Europa, Jupiter's moon, has an ocean beneath miles of ice. Enceladus, one of Saturn's moons, has geysers erupting from an underground ocean. If we wanted to understand how to explore those worlds, how to design equipment that could survive those conditions, how to search for life in those environments, we needed to start here, in our own ocean. Harlan took a sip of coffee, his hands steady despite his age. But the deeper we went, he continued, his voice dropping even lower, the more we encountered things that didn't fit any model we had. Sonar reading that showed geometric precision, where only irregular geology should exist. Electromagnetic disturbances with no natural source. Acoustic signatures that suggested machinery operating at depths, where pressure should make any mechanical system impossible, using any technology we understood. What kind of structures? Lena asked, leaning forward. Harlan glanced around the cafe, even though no one was sitting close enough to overhear. The gesture seemed automatic, a reflex from decades of security consciousness. The first one was found in 1974, February if I remember correctly, a sonar mapping mission in the Puerto Rico Trench, the deepest point in the Atlantic Ocean. They were using a new high-resolution side-scan sonar array, something we had just developed. The resolution was unprecedented for that time. They picked up what looked like a perfectly circular formation at the bottom, 20 miles in diameter. Perfectly circular. They did multiple passes over 3 days. Same result every time. The resolution wasn't good enough to see fine details, but the shape was unmistakable. Nature doesn't make circles that precise, especially not that large. Why wasn't this announced? Lena asked, though she already suspected the answer. Because of what happened next, Harlan said, his eyes distant, remembering. When they sent a submersible down to investigate 2 weeks later, the formation was gone. Not buried under a recent sediment flow, not obscured by a debris field from some underwater landslide. Gone. The seafloor in that location was smooth and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. But we had sonar images from just 14 days earlier showing it clear as day. Multiple passes, multiple confirmation scans, then nothing. Lena felt a chill despite the warm Florida afternoon streaming through the cafe windows. The only explanation that made sense was that it had moved. But the implications of that, of something that large moving deliberately and then concealing itself, were too disturbing to put in a report. So the official conclusion was equipment malfunction, a glitch in the new sonar system. Never mind that the same system worked perfectly before and after that mission. The second incident was in 1976 in the Tonga Trench. That's the one Marvin Elridge was part of. You've seen his logbook, so you know what they found. Metal signatures and right-angle construction at a depth of over 35,000 feet. When they tried to investigate, all their equipment failed simultaneously. Not broke down over time. Not showed signs of degrading performance. Failed. All at once. As if something had actively shut it down with a directed electromagnetic pulse. Harlan paused, and Lena could see him deciding how much to share. And the third, she prompted gently, Mariana Trench, November 1977, a joint mission with the Navy. They weren't looking for anything unusual. They were testing new depth pressure sensors, equipment that could survive in the deepest place on Earth. Boring technical work. But what they found was a massive object sitting on the ocean floor at a depth of 35,800 feet. The sonar images showed what looked like a vessel or structure, except it was too large to be anything humanity has ever built. Length estimated at over 1/2 mile, width approximately 200 feet. Sitting at the deepest point on Earth, in a place where no human had ever been, where pressure should crush anything not specifically designed to withstand it. Harlan's coffee sat forgotten, cooling in front of him. After that mission, everything changed. People from the Department of Defense started showing up at our facilities, not consultants or liaisons, people with serious security clearances who didn't introduce themselves or explain why they were there. Scientists were pulled aside for private meetings. Documents were reclassified retroactively. And then, very quickly, all ocean programs were shut down. Money was reallocated to space programs. Personnel were reassigned or encouraged to retire. And we were told, very clearly through official and unofficial channels, that we were to focus exclusively on space from that point forward. Did they ever tell you why? Lena asked. Harlan looked at her directly, his engineer's mind clearly deciding to trust her with something he had kept quiet for decades. Not officially. But the rumour among those of us who had been there long enough, who knew how to read between the lines of classified briefings, was simple. Something in the ocean had responded to us. Our sonar pings, our submersibles, our equipment. We had been noticed, observed, scanned, evaluated, and someone at the highest levels of government decided that the appropriate response was to leave it alone, to stop probing, to stop investigating. NASA was told to redirect all resources to space and never come back to the deep ocean. Lena spent hours with Harlan that day, filling notebook after notebook with details. He gave her names of other scientists who had been involved, though he warned that most were dead now. He provided specific dates and mission numbers that she could cross-reference. He described technology that had never been publicly acknowledged. Pressure vessels capable of withstanding depths that the official record claimed were impossible at the time. Before she left, Harlan reached into his wallet and pulled out a small photograph, faded and creased from years of being carried. It showed a group of people on the deck of a research vessel. Young engineers in their 30s and 40s, squinting in bright sunlight, smiling the way people do in workplace photos. That's the team from the Mariana Trench mission, he said. November 1977. 12 people in that photo. By 1985, 9 of them were dead. Heart attacks, car accidents, 1 drowning, 1 house fire. The official causes were always natural or accidental, but the statistical probability of that many deaths in such a small group over such a short time period is astronomically low. He pointed to a man in the centre of the photo. That's me. And that, he pointed to a woman on the right side, is Marvin Elridge's sister. She was a systems engineer. Brilliant woman. She died in '84 from what they called a sudden brain aneurysm. She was 39 years old, perfectly healthy, no family history of that condition. Lena looked at the photograph for a long time, at the smiling faces of people who had no idea what they were about to discover or what it would cost them. "Why are you still alive?" she asked quietly. Harlan smiled, but there was no humour in it. "Because I kept my mouth shut. I signed the papers. I accepted the reassignment. I never spoke to journalists or wrote about what we found. I made myself harmless, and apparently they decided I was worth more alive as an example of compliance than dead as a martyr." He paused. "But I'm 83 now. My wife died 2 years ago. My children rarely visit. At this point, I'd rather die having told someone the truth than live another year carrying it alone." 2 weeks later, Harlan Vick was found dead in his apartment by the facility's morning wellness check. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, which wasn't particularly unusual for a man in his 80s with a documented history of cardiac issues. The facility's medical staff noted that he had seemed in good spirits the day before, had eaten a full dinner, and had been seen walking around the artificial lake that evening. But when Lena tried to contact the other names Harlan had given her, she found that 2 had also died in the past 5 years, both from natural causes according to official records. The other 3 names turned up no results at all, as if those people had never existed or had their identities completely scrubbed from all databases. Lena attended Harlan's funeral. It was small, poorly attended. His children were there but seemed uncomfortable, eager to complete the formalities and leave. She was the only person there who wasn't family. After the service, she stood by his grave for a while, looking at the temporary marker that would eventually be replaced with a permanent stone. She noticed a man in a dark suit standing near a tree about 50 yards away. He wasn't trying to hide, but he wasn't participating in the funeral either, just watching. When Lena made eye contact with him, he nodded slightly, then walked to a black sedan and drove away. The message was clear. They knew she had talked to Harlan, they knew what he had told her, and they wanted her to know that they knew. Lena knew she was onto something real now, something that people in power had worked very hard to keep quiet for over 4 decades. She became obsessed with finding more evidence, more proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. She spent months cross-referencing coordinates. The logbook from Marvin Elridge's mission had included precise latitude and longitude readings for each sonar anomaly they detected. Lena began plotting these on maps, using modern satellite data and bathymetric charts to see if any patterns emerged. What she found was extraordinary. The anomalies weren't random. They formed a geometric lattice pattern stretching across huge sections of the Pacific Ocean floor. Massive triangular points separated by hundreds of miles, but aligned with mathematical precision. Each point corresponded to one of the deepest trenches or abyssal plains in the Pacific, and they were still there. Modern sonar data, when examined carefully, showed the same unexplained signatures. Not as obvious now, perhaps better hidden or less active, but present. Whatever NASA had found in the 1970s was still there. Lena's search led her to a forgotten archive in the Library of Congress. Among microfilm reels labelled as routine congressional briefings, she found something that didn't belong. A transcript dated November 1977, marked Eyes Only Limited Distribution. The transcript documented a conversation between a NASA oceanographer named Saul Riggin and an unnamed Department of Defense liaison. Lena had to read through the stilted bureaucratic language carefully, but the meaning was clear. Riggin reported that during a deep ocean scan, their equipment had been actively pinged by an unknown source, not passively detected, actively engaged with. The source had used frequencies that matched their own sonar, as if learning and mimicking their technology in real time. The Department of Defense liaison's response was blunt. "You are to shut down all exploration immediately. This is not a NASA matter anymore." Riggin protested. "But it's intelligent. Whatever is down there responded to us deliberately. This is the most important discovery in human history." The liaison's reply was chilling. "That's exactly why you're done. This matter is being transferred to agencies with appropriate security protocols. NASA will redirect all resources to space exploration. This decision is not negotiable." The transcript ended there. Lena searched for any follow-up documents, any indication of what appropriate agencies meant, any hint of what happened to Saul Riggin. She found nothing. His name appeared in NASA employment records until 1979, then vanished completely. No retirement notice, no obituary, just gone. But Lena found one more document. It was filed incorrectly, labelled as a budget allocation memo, but the content was far more significant. ABVS Protocol, Level 6 security clearance required, initiated March 1979. The objective was stated in precise bureaucratic language. Transfer all deep ocean findings and related research to Classified Naval Special Projects Division. Prevent public scientific agencies from further contact with designated zones. Redirect NASA resources exclusively to space exploration programs. And then the reason, in a single paragraph that had been partially redacted but was still readable. Containment of non-human submerged intelligence structures to prevent unauthorized contact and potential security breach. Lena read that paragraph 10 times. Non-human submerged intelligence structures, not alien spacecraft, not ancient ruins. Intelligence structures currently active and requiring containment. Something alive, or at least functional, beneath the ocean. NASA didn't choose to abandon the ocean. They were ordered to. They were forced into space to avoid something that had been discovered in the deep. Something that someone in power had decided humanity wasn't ready to know about. Lena understood now why Marvin Elridge had died. Why Harlan Vick had waited so long to speak. Why every scientist involved had either gone silent or disappeared. This wasn't just classified information. This was something that powerful people wanted to remain buried deeper than the trenches themselves. She should have stopped there. She should have published what she had found and let others take the risk of digging deeper. But Lena couldn't let it go. She needed to see more. She needed proof that couldn't be denied. That's when she started noticing the surveillance. It began subtly. A car parked across the street from her apartment for hours at a time. Engine off, windows tinted. The same vehicle appeared outside the archive where she worked. When she drove to meetings or interviews, the car was always 3 or 4 vehicles behind her in traffic. Her personal computer began acting strangely. Files would be in different folders than where she had left them. Her internet search history would be wiped clean each morning, even though she hadn't cleared it. Her backup drives disappeared from her apartment while she was at work, despite the door being locked and showing no signs of forced entry. Someone was watching her. Someone knew what she was researching, and they wanted her to know that they knew. A former NOAA technician reached out to her through an encrypted email service 2 months after Harlan's death. The message was brief. I have something you need to see, something they didn't collect. Come alone. Tell no one. It included a date, time, and location. A parking garage in Baltimore at midnight. Every instinct told Lena this was dangerous. Meeting a stranger at midnight with something classified was exactly the kind of thing that ended badly in stories like this. But she'd gone too far to stop now. She drove to Baltimore, parked on a different level than specified, and walked down the concrete stairs to the designated meeting spot. The technician was waiting near a support pillar, a man in his 70s wearing a windbreaker and a baseball cap. He looked nervous, his eyes constantly scanning the garage. He didn't give his name, didn't shake her hand, didn't waste time with pleasantries. I worked with Marvin Elridge in 1976 and 77, he said quietly. I was the one who processed the film reels from the submersibles. Every mission, I'd develop the footage, catalogue it and send it up the chain. After the Tonga Trench incident, men in suits showed up and collected everything. Every reel, every photograph, every piece of paper. They went through our facility like it had been raided. He handed her a metal film canister, old and dented, with faded labels barely visible in the dim garage lighting. This is from the Elridge mission. Dive 7. I made a copy before they collected the originals. I've kept it hidden for 46 years. I buried it in my backyard inside a waterproof container. I told myself I was keeping it for history, for proof, but really I think I was just too afraid to destroy it, and too afraid to show it to anyone. My wife died last year. My kids don't talk to me. I have cancer. The doctors say I have 6 months, maybe less. I don't know what to do with this anymore, but I know it shouldn't die with me. Maybe you'll know what to do with it. He turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at her. They killed him, you know. Marvin. It wasn't an accident. He called me 3 days before he died. Said people were following him. Said his house had been searched while he was at work. Nothing taken, but everything subtly moved. Drawers not quite closed the way he left them. Papers in slightly different positions. He knew what was coming. He told me to destroy anything he had ever given me, to forget everything we had talked about. I wish I had listened. Then he walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty garage, and was gone. Lena stood there for several minutes, holding the film canister, feeling its weight, understanding that she was now holding something that people had killed to keep hidden. She took the film to a professional restoration service in Virginia, driving 2 hours out of her way, paying cash, and claiming it was family footage from a deep-sea fishing trip in the 70s. The technicians were more interested in the technical challenge than the content. Film this old, stored in less than ideal conditions, required careful handling. They cleaned it, stabilised it, and digitised it over 3 days. When Lena finally watched the restored footage on her laptop in a motel room, sitting in the dark with headphones on, she understood why this had been classified, why people had died, why an entire federal agency had been redirected away from the ocean. The video showed the view from a submersible's external camera, the timestamp in the corner marking it as November 17th, 1976 at 22:43 hours. Depth reading, 11,280 feet. At first, there was only darkness, and the occasional particle drifting past the lens caught in the submersible's powerful lights. The view swayed gently as the craft moved through the water. Then the lights illuminated something that made Lena pause the video, rewind, and watch again to confirm she wasn't seeing things. A massive curved surface, clearly metallic, extending beyond the reach of the lights in all directions. The texture was smooth, but not perfectly so. There were patterns etched or moulded into the surface, geometric designs too regular to be corrosion or damage. They looked deliberate, designed. The material itself had a strange quality to it, reflecting the lights in a way that seemed almost to absorb them, creating a darkness that was deeper than the surrounding water. The submersible moved along the surface, and the camera captured more details. What appeared to be seams where different sections met, too precise to be natural geological features. Structures that might have been protrusions, sensors, or ports of some kind. Curved indentations that could have been anything from decorative elements to functional openings. And then something that looked unmistakably like a window. A circular opening about 15 feet in diameter, filled with what might have been transparent material, though it was impossible to tell in the murky water and dim light. The surface around it had additional geometric patterns, as if marking it as significant. The submersible's lights focused on the window, and Lena watched this section frame by frame, advancing through the video one image at a time. For 3 frames, barely a tenth of a second of real time, something appeared in the reflection of the glass or whatever material filled that circular opening. A shape. Definitely a shape. Not a trick of light or a distortion from the water. Something inside the structure, moving past the window. The resolution wasn't good enough to make out details. It could have been machinery. It could have been something else. But it was there, visible, real, captured on film. Then the lights failed. The video feed dissolved into static, but the recording continued, the timestamp still, advancing. The audio kept running, and Lena had to increase the volume to hear what came next. A low-frequency tone, deep and resonant, felt more than heard even through laptop speakers. Not the sound of machinery or water pressure or any mechanical system she recognized. The frequency was around 20 hertz, right at the edge of human hearing, kind of deep bass that you feel in your chest more than hear with your ears. But what made Lena's skin crawl was the pattern. The tone rose and fell in a sequence that repeated. Not random, not mechanical. It had rhythm. It had structure. It sounded almost like language, like something trying to communicate using sound in a frequency range that would travel through water effectively. She played it back multiple times, recording the audio on her phone, analysing the waveform. The pattern repeated every 11 seconds. Each repetition was identical in structure, but varied slightly in amplitude, as if the source was adjusting, testing, learning how to modulate the signal. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The audio went silent except for the quiet hiss of the recording equipment. The video timestamp showed the camera had recorded for another 18 minutes after the lights failed, but that entire section was corrupted or erased, showing only digital artifacts and noise. The footage ended. Lena sat in the dark motel room, her hands shaking slightly. She had just watched proof, real, documented, recorded proof that something intelligent existed in the deep ocean, something that built structures, something that noticed when we came looking, something that responded. Lena tried to contact the technician who had given her the film. His phone number was disconnected. The email address bounced back as non-existent. She drove to the address he had mentioned working from decades ago, but found only an abandoned building. He had vanished, just like everyone else who got too close to the truth. Lena knew she was running out of time. The surveillance was getting more obvious, almost as if whoever was watching wanted her to know they were closing in. She made copies of everything she'd found and distributed them to trusted colleagues, with instructions to release the information if anything happened to her. Then she did something risky. She used the coordinates from the classified documents to search for current military activity in those ocean regions. What she found was surprising. There were naval installations positioned near each of the major anomaly sites, not scientific research stations, military bases, some of them appearing on maps, others only visible through careful cross-referencing of shipping routes and no-fly zones. One installation in particular caught her attention, a naval facility near Pearl Harbor with unusual security protocols. Shipping manifests showed regular transport of materials to and from the facility, but the cargo descriptions were always vague. Research materials, equipment, components, classified payload. Lena travelled to Hawaii on a Tuesday morning in late August. She rented a car under her own name, stayed in a chain hotel and tried to appear like any other tourist. But she spent her days carefully observing the naval facility from various vantage points, using hiking trails and public beaches that offered distant views of the installation. The security was extraordinary. Multiple perimeter fences, each one taller than the last, guard towers with visible security personnel, sensor arrays that covered every approach, motion detectors, cameras, lights powerful enough to turn night into day. She watched security patrols follow precise patterns, vehicles checking the perimeter every 40 minutes like clockwork. But what interested her most was the shipping activity. Large trucks arrived multiple times per day, always with military police escorts. The containers they carried were standard military issue, but several had markings she could make out through her long lens camera. Abyss, non-terrestrial materials, level 6 clearance required, non-terrestrial materials. The same classification code from the 1979 protocol document. The same code that appeared in the classified memos she'd copied. They were still actively engaged with whatever had been found in the deep ocean. This wasn't ancient history being studied in some forgotten warehouse. This was ongoing, current, active. Lena spent 3 days photographing the facility, documenting the security procedures, noting the arrival and departure patterns. She was careful never to stay in one location too long, never to appear too interested, never to do anything that might flag her as surveillance. But on the third evening, as she sat in her rental car at a scenic overlook several miles from the facility, she noticed a black SUV parked 3 spaces down from her. It had been there when she arrived 30 minutes earlier, and it hadn't moved. The windows were tinted, but she could see the faint silhouette of someone inside. She started her car and drove back toward her hotel. The SUV followed, maintaining a consistent distance of 3 or 4 vehicles behind her, not trying to hide, making sure she knew they were there. Lena's heart rate increased, but she forced herself to drive normally. She pulled into a shopping centre, parked, and went into a grocery store. The SUV parked at the far end of the lot. When she came out 15 minutes later with a bag containing items she didn't need, the SUV was still there. The message was clear. We see you. We know what you're looking for, and we want you to know that we know. That night, Lena sat in her hotel room with all the documents, photos and recordings she had collected spread across the bed. She had enough. Documents proving NASA's sudden withdrawal from ocean exploration. Testimony from scientists who had been there. Film footage showing an underwater structure that couldn't be natural. Photographs of current military operations at coordinates matching the original anomaly sites. She began organising everything into a comprehensive report. She wrote through the night, knowing that once she released this information, there would be no going back. Her life would change irrevocably. She might face legal consequences. She might face worse. But the truth deserved to be known. Whatever was in the ocean, humanity had a right to know about it. Scientists had died trying to bring this information to light. Their deaths shouldn't be meaningless. At 3 a.m, she called a colleague she trusted, another archivist named Thomas Brennan who had worked with her for years, a man who understood the importance of preserving historical truth. The call went to voicemail. Lena's voice was steady but urgent. "Thomas, it's Lena. I need you to listen carefully. NASA left the ocean in 1979 because they found something. Not ancient ruins, not crashed spacecraft. Something alive, something intelligent, living in structures beneath miles of water in the deepest trenches on Earth. They've been there longer than human civilization, probably longer than humans have existed at all. In 1976 and 77, multiple deep ocean missions encountered these structures. Every time we came close, every time we tried to investigate, the equipment failed, but not randomly, deliberately. These things, whatever they are, they responded to us. They noticed us. They actively prevented us from getting too close. And someone at the highest levels of government made a deal, or a decision, or maybe just realised that humanity wasn't ready to know we're not the first intelligent species on this planet. They ordered NASA to abandon all ocean research. They classified everything. They silenced everyone who tried to speak about it. I have proof, documents, testimony from scientists who were there, film footage showing one of these structures. It's all real, Thomas. Every conspiracy theory about NASA hiding ocean discoveries, it's all based on truth. They just got the reason wrong. We didn't find aliens from space. We found something that was already here. I'm going to release everything tomorrow morning. I've made multiple copies. I've distributed them to people I trust. If anything happens to me, make sure this gets out. Make sure people know. Humanity deserves to know we're not alone. We've never been alone. She hung up. Then she sent encrypted files to 3 other colleagues, academics who specialised in government transparency and scientific fraud. The files contained everything she had found: copies of the classified documents, Harlan Vick's testimony, the digitised film footage, photographs of the naval facility. At 6 in the morning she packed her laptop, her camera and the original documents into her bag. She checked out of the hotel and started driving toward Honolulu International Airport. Her flight wasn't until evening, but she wanted to be somewhere public, somewhere with security cameras and witnesses. She never made it to the airport. At 8:15 in the morning, a highway patrol officer found Lena's rental car abandoned on Highway 3, a relatively quiet stretch of road about 12 miles outside of Pearl Harbor. The engine was still running, the driver's door was open, her keys were in the ignition. Her phone was on the passenger seat, battery removed and placed carefully beside it. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no evidence of an accident. The car showed no damage. There were no skid marks on the road. Her suitcase was still in the trunk. Her purse was still in the front seat, wallet and credit cards intact. Lena Hart Boone had simply vanished. Within 6 hours, federal agents arrived at the scene. They took the car, they took everything in it, and they issued orders to local police that this was now a federal matter. No press releases, no public statements. The investigation would be handled at a higher level. Within 12 hours, more federal agents raided Lena's apartment in Maryland. They arrived with a warrant so heavily redacted that the property manager couldn't even tell what specific items they were authorized to seize. They took her computer, her files, her backup drives, her notebooks. They took everything. They interviewed her colleagues at the archive facility. The interviews were polite but firm. They explained that Lena had been involved in unauthorized access of classified materials, that her recent behaviour suggested significant psychological stress, that anyone who had received documents from her should turn them over immediately and refrain from discussing her work with anyone, as doing so could result in serious legal consequences. The official statement from authorities was brief and carefully worded. Lena Hart Boone had been reported missing. Her vehicle had been found abandoned in Hawaii. There was no evidence of foul play. Given her recent behaviour and the stress she had been under, authorities believed she may have wandered away from her vehicle in a state of confusion or distress. Search efforts were underway. The public was asked to contact authorities if they had any information. No mention of classified documents. No mention of NASA or ocean exploration. No mention of what she'd been researching. Just a troubled woman who had disappeared, probably due to mental health issues. Nothing more to see here. Thomas Brennan received the voicemail that evening when he woke up for his night shift at the archive facility. He listened to it 3 times, his blood chilling more with each repetition. He immediately checked his encrypted email and found the files Lena had sent him. Everything she had mentioned. All the proof. For 2 days he debated what to do. Then 2 federal agents appeared at his home. They were polite, professional. They explained that Lena had been suffering from a mental health crisis, that she had been accessing classified materials without authorization, that any documents she had shared were the product of her deteriorating mental state and should not be taken seriously. They asked if she'd sent him anything, if she'd shared her theories with him, if he had any of her documents. Thomas lied. He said no. He said Lena had seemed stressed lately but hadn't shared any specifics of her work. He said he was worried about her and hoped she would be found safely. The agents thanked him and left, but Thomas noticed the car parked down the street that evening, and the next evening, and the evening after that. He deleted the encrypted files without looking at them again. He erased Lena's voicemail. He told himself he was being smart, not cowardly, that he had a family to think about, that getting himself killed or disappeared wouldn't honour Lena's sacrifice. The other colleagues Lena had sent files to made similar choices. The risks were too great. The evidence could be dismissed as forgery. The penalties for possessing classified materials were severe. One by one, they deleted the files or turned them over to authorities. Within a week, it was as if Lena's entire investigation had never existed. But 1 week after her disappearance, on a Thursday at 2:17 in the morning, a single document appeared on an anonymous forum dedicated to government conspiracies and unexplained phenomena. The forum had existed for years, a place where people shared theories about everything, from UFOs to assassinations to hidden technologies. Most of it was speculation and wishful thinking. This post was different. It was uploaded from an untraceable account that had been created minutes before the post appeared. The routing data, analysed later by forum administrators and independent researchers, showed the post had bounced through 17 different countries, using VPN services and proxy servers to obscure its origin. Whoever posted it understood digital security in a way that suggested either professional training or serious paranoia. The post contained a comprehensive summary of everything Lena had discovered. The 1976 and 77 ocean missions, the classified documents showing NASA's sudden withdrawal, the testimony from deceased scientists, the description of structures found in the deepest trenches, the geometric lattice pattern connecting the anomaly sites across the Pacific, and it included a scanned page from what appeared to be a classified government memorandum, marked with security classifications that verified it as authentic to anyone who understood government document formatting. The memo was dated March 1979 and included partial text from what was clearly the Abyss Protocol. The post read, "We didn't stop exploring the ocean because we couldn't. We stopped because we were told not to disturb what's down there. They've been watching us for as long as we've been watching the stars. The Abyss Protocol isn't about preventing contact. It's about managing a relationship that began long before NASA was even founded. Someone made an agreement. We stay in the atmosphere and space. They stay in the deep ocean. As long as neither side violates the boundary, we coexist. But if we go back down there, if we start probing again with modern technology, the agreement ends, and nobody in power wants to know what happens then." The post was live for exactly 5 minutes. In that time, 47 people viewed it. 12 took screenshots. 3 downloaded the attached document. Then it was gone, deleted. The account that posted it vanished from the server logs as if it had never existed. The forum's administrators received an official government order within an hour, demanding they surrender all server logs, IP addresses, and any cached versions of the deleted content. The order came with specific federal statute citations and a warning that failure to comply would result in the forum being shut down and its operators facing criminal charges. The administrators complied. They turned over everything they had. But the technical analysis showed something the government didn't want to acknowledge. Whoever posted that information had skills that exceeded typical internet users. The routing was sophisticated. The security measures were professional grade. This wasn't some random conspiracy theorist. This was someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who had planned this carefully. The 12 people who had taken screenshots began sharing them on other platforms. Reddit, Twitter, obscure forums dedicated to ocean mysteries. For about 48 hours, the story gained traction. People debated whether the documents were real. Amateur analysts examined the formatting and concluded the memo appeared authentic. Researchers dug into NASA's history and confirmed that the agency had indeed abandoned ocean programs in the late 1970s with minimal explanation. Then the systematic suppression began. Posts were removed from major platforms, sometimes within minutes of being uploaded. Accounts were suspended for spreading misinformation. Fact-checking organisations issued statements saying the documents had been examined and deemed false, though they never explained who examined them or what specific evidence proved them fraudulent. Within a week, the story had been effectively scrubbed from mainstream internet platforms. It remained only in the darker corners of the web, on encrypted forums and conspiracy sites where it blended in with hundreds of other unverifiable claims about government secrets. The official narrative became fixed. Lena Hart Boone had experienced a mental health crisis. She had developed paranoid delusions about government cover-ups. She had fabricated or altered documents to support her theories. Her disappearance was tragic, but likely the result of her deteriorating mental state. The documents she supposedly found were either forgeries or legitimate materials taken wildly out of context. Researchers who looked into the story found nothing solid to grasp. Lena's disappearance was real and documented, but the content of her research was impossible to verify. The documents she supposedly found had vanished. The people she interviewed were dead or refused to speak. The footage no longer existed in any archive, public or private. Even the forum post couldn't be verified since the original had been deleted, and the screenshots could have been fabricated. For a few weeks, the story circulated among communities interested in government conspiracies and hidden knowledge. Then it faded, replaced by newer theories and more recent mysteries. Lena Hart Boone became another name on a long list of people who claimed to have found something significant, and then disappeared. Another unsolved mystery. Another story that couldn't be proven or disproven. But in late October 2023, on a Saturday morning when most of America was sleeping in or having breakfast with their families, something happened that brought the whole story roaring back. A satellite image appeared on an anonymous image-sharing platform. Not one of the major social media sites, but a smaller platform used primarily by researchers and scientists to share large technical files. The image was uploaded at 6:32 in the morning Eastern Time from an account with no history, no profile information, and a username that was just a random string of numbers and letters. The metadata had been carefully stripped from the image file, making it impossible to determine when or by what satellite it had been captured. But analysis of the photograph itself, conducted later by independent researchers with expertise in satellite imaging, suggested it came from a commercial constellation that provided high-resolution ocean imagery for scientific research. The specific characteristics of the image, the angle, the resolution, and the wavelength sensitivity all matched known specifications of satellites operated by a European space agency that sold data commercially. The image showed a section of the Mariana Trench, the deepest point on Earth, Challenger Deep, nearly 7 miles below the ocean surface, over 35,000 feet down, a place where pressure exceeds 16,000 pounds per square inch, a place where humans have visited only 4 times in all of history. The last visit had been 2 years earlier. The resolution was extraordinary. Modern satellite technology, using advanced synthetic aperture radar and other sensing methods, could penetrate water to surprising depths and create detailed maps of seafloor topography. This image had been processed to show bathymetric features with clarity that was almost shocking. And visible in the image, clear enough to leave absolutely no doubt, was a perfectly symmetrical hexagonal structure. Each side measured over 10 miles in length. The formation was slightly elevated from the surrounding seafloor, rising about 800 feet above the base level, as if it were sitting on the surface rather than being part of the natural geological formation. The edges were too precise to be natural, the angles too perfect, the symmetry too exact. But what made the image truly extraordinary was the thermal data overlaid on the visual imagery. The satellite had infrared capability, and someone had processed the data to show temperature variations across the scanned area. The structure was glowing. not with visible light, but with heat. At a depth where the ambient temperature should be just above freezing, barely 2 degrees Celsius, this structure was radiating warmth. The thermal signature showed temperatures ranging from 15 to 20 degrees Celsius, significantly above ambient. The pattern wasn't uniform either. There were areas of higher temperature, suggesting internal heat sources or power generation. The heat radiated outward in a way that suggested active systems, not passive geological warming from volcanic activity. And at the centre of the hexagon, there appeared to be an opening, a dark space where both the visual and thermal signatures dropped significantly, as if something was channeling that energy inward or allowing access to whatever was below. The opening was roughly circular, about 2 miles in diameter, and perfectly centred within the hexagonal structure. The surrounding seafloor showed no similar features, just the structure, sitting alone in the darkness of the deepest place on Earth, active and warm and geometrically impossible. The image included a scale bar and coordinates. Anyone with basic knowledge of geographic information systems could verify that this was indeed Challenger Deep, at precisely the deepest measured point in the Mariana Trench. The location matched historical records of depth measurements and previous mapping efforts. Within the first hour, the image was viewed by 300 people, scientists, researchers, ocean enthusiasts, and people who followed maritime mysteries. Many of them downloaded the full resolution file. Some immediately began analysing it, checking the metadata, examining the pixels for signs of manipulation or forgery. Their initial findings were disturbing. The image didn't show obvious signs of digital manipulation. The noise patterns were consistent with legitimate satellite imagery. The compression artifacts looked natural. The thermal data aligned properly with the visual data in ways that would be extremely difficult to fake convincingly. The post that accompanied the image contained no explanation, no manifesto, no detailed claims. Just the image and a title that sent chills through everyone who read it. NASA was right to leave. Within 6 minutes of being posted, the image was gone. The account deleted. The platform's administrators later reported that they had received what appeared to be an automated takedown request citing national security concerns. The request had come with federal authentication codes that the administrators had no way to verify or challenge. But by then, it was too late. 300 downloads had already been made, screenshots had been captured, the image had been shared to other platforms, and once something reaches the internet, it never truly disappears. Over the next 48 hours, the image spread. Reddit communities dedicated to ocean mysteries erupted in debate. Twitter accounts shared compressed versions. YouTube videos analysing the image began appearing, some racking up hundreds of thousands of views before they too were removed for unspecified violations of community guidelines. Independent analysts worked to verify the image's authenticity. Several with expertise in satellite imaging concluded that it appeared to be legitimate. The thermal characteristics were consistent with real infrared data. The bathymetric details matched known features of the Mariana Trench. If it was a fake, it was an extraordinarily sophisticated one that would have required access to genuine satellite data and considerable technical expertise. But verification was impossible, because nobody could identify the source satellite or the capture date. The European Space Agency that operated the most likely satellite constellation denied having any knowledge of the image. When pressed for their own imagery of that location, they stated that their satellites didn't routinely image Challenger Deep due to limited commercial interest, and any existing imagery was restricted for purchase by licensed researchers only. Governments refused to comment. NASA issued a carefully worded statement saying they had no current ocean exploration programs and couldn't verify the authenticity of any images being circulated on social media. They encouraged people to be skeptical of unverified information from unknown sources. The Navy simply declined to respond to inquiries from journalists. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration released a statement explaining that seafloor features could sometimes appear geometric due to natural geological processes, and that thermal anomalies near trenches were often caused by volcanic activity or unique pressure conditions. They made no specific reference to the image in question, and didn't address why this particular formation was so perfectly hexagonal, or why it was located at a point with no known volcanic activity. But researchers who knew where to look found something interesting that couldn't be easily dismissed or explained away. In the weeks following the leaked image, there was a significant and measurable increase in military ship activity near the Mariana Trench. Data from commercial ship tracking services, which monitor vessel movements using AS transponders, showed unusual patterns. Naval vessels that official records claimed were conducting routine exercises in other parts of the Pacific had their transponders go dark for extended periods. When they reappeared, their position suggested they had been operating near the Mariana Trench during those dark periods. Submarine activity, which is harder to track but can be inferred from support vessel movements, and military communication patterns also increased. Attack submarines require surface support ships for long-range operations. The movement of these support vessels suggested increased submarine presence in the region. Scientific research vessels that had been scheduled to work in that region suddenly had their permits revoked without explanation. Applications for new research permits were denied or indefinitely delayed. Independent researchers who tried to book commercial deep-sea exploration found that the coordinates they requested were unavailable due to unspecified military operations. Amateur satellite watchers, people who track military reconnaissance satellites as a hobby, noticed that several satellites altered their orbits to provide more frequent coverage of the Challenger Deep area. The orbital changes were small but measurable, suggesting someone wanted more regular imaging of that specific location. Commercial fishing vessels reported increased military presence. Boats that had been working in international waters for decades suddenly found themselves being approached by Navy ships and asked to relocate. The requests were polite but firm. The explanations were vague. Ongoing operations, safety concerns, routine exercises. But the fishing captains who had worked those waters for years had never seen that kind of military activity before. Radio operators who monitor military frequencies reported increased encrypted communications on channels known to be used for submarine operations. The volume of traffic suggested significant coordination efforts, the kind that would accompany major operational deployment, not routine exercises. None of this information appeared in mainstream news. Individual pieces of it showed up on specialized forums, maritime industry publications, and military tracking websites. But nobody connected all the pieces into a comprehensive picture. Or if they did, they didn't publish it. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. Something was happening in the Mariana Trench. The military was responding to something, and whatever it was, they didn't want civilian scientists or researchers anywhere near it. One commercial pilot, flying a regular route from Japan to Australia that passed within range of the Mariana Trench, reported seeing unusual surface activity during a night flight. He described seeing what looked like bioluminescence, except the pattern was too regular, too geometric. He filed a routine observation report as pilots are required to do for any unusual phenomena. The report was acknowledged, then classified. When he tried to discuss it later with colleagues, he was visited by two men who identified themselves as air safety investigators. They explained that his observation had been determined to be a misidentification of fishing vessel lights, and that further discussion of the matter could impact his pilot certification. He stopped talking about it. A marine biologist conducting independent research on deep-sea species, using a small autonomous underwater vehicle she had built herself, submitted a request to operate near the Challenger Deep. Her request was denied. When she asked for an explanation, she was told that military operations were ongoing in the region, and all civilian research activities were temporarily suspended for safety reasons. When she asked when the suspension would be lifted, she was told that information was not available. 6 months later, the suspension was still in effect. Something was happening in the deep ocean, something that required a military presence, something that someone in power didn't want civilian scientists, researchers, or the general public getting close to. And it was happening at the exact location where a satellite image had shown an impossible structure. The Abyss Protocol, it seemed, was still very much in effect, and whatever agreement or decision had been made in 1979 was being actively enforced in 2023. The Abyss Protocol, it seemed, was still very much in effect. Today, if you search for information about NASA's ocean exploration programs from the 1970s, you'll find basic historical facts. The partnership with NOAA, the development of deep ocean technology, the successful missions that mapped volcanic vents and discovered new species, straightforward, unremarkable history. But you won't find anything about why it ended so abruptly. You won't find details about the anomalies that were reported. You won't find the names of the scientists who tried to speak out and died under circumstances that were always ruled natural or accidental. All of that has been scrubbed, classified, or lost to time. In March of 2024, a Freedom of Information request was filed asking for all NASA documents related to ocean exploration programs from 1975 to 1980. The request was filed by a law firm representing an anonymous client. 3 months later, the response arrived. 7,000 pages of documents so heavily redacted that entire sections were nothing but black bars. Page after page of blacked out text with only occasional phrases visible. Depth readings nominal. Equipment functioning as expected. Mission concluded successfully. Nothing about the anomalies. Nothing about the structures. Nothing about the decision to end all ocean programs. Just routine operational reports with anything meaningful removed. The law firm filed an appeal, arguing that excessive redaction violated the spirit of transparency laws. The appeal was denied. The stated reason: matters of national security. No further explanation provided. On July 4th, 2024, during a holiday weekend when most Americans were watching fireworks and having barbecues, the Mariana Trench Marine National Monument was quietly expanded. The expansion added nearly 30,000 square miles of protected ocean to the monument, including the entire area around Challenger Deep. The expansion came with new restrictions: no commercial fishing, no research without specific federal permits, no unauthorized vessel activity. The announcement was buried in a routine Department of the Interior press release that mentioned several unrelated administrative actions. No press conference, no statements from the White House, just a few paragraphs in a document that most news organizations never bothered to read. The restrictions were immediate and strictly enforced. The Coast Guard began regular patrols of the expanded monument area. Any vessel entering without proper authorization was intercepted and escorted out. The penalties for violation were severe: fines up to $250,000 and potential criminal charges. When environmental groups asked about the sudden expansion and increased restrictions, they were told it was part of ongoing efforts to protect unique deep-sea ecosystems from disturbance. When marine researchers applied for permits to study the newly protected areas, their applications were either denied or delayed indefinitely pending unspecified security reviews. The message was clear: the deepest parts of the Mariana Trench were now effectively off-limits to everyone, except those with the highest security clearances. In November 2024, a research paper was published in an obscure marine biology journal. The paper, written by a team of Japanese scientists, described acoustic anomalies detected near several deep ocean trenches between 2020 and 2022. The anomalies consisted of low-frequency sounds that didn't match any known biological or geological sources. The frequencies suggested possible mechanical origins. The patterns suggested possible intelligence. The paper was peer-reviewed and published. It remained available for exactly 9 days. Then it was retracted. The journal issued a statement saying the data had been found to contain errors, and the conclusions were not supported by the evidence. The authors protested, claiming their data was sound, and the retraction was unjustified. Their protests were ignored. Copies of the paper exist in academic archives and can still be found by determined researchers, but its retraction means it can't be cited in other scientific work, effectively erasing it from legitimate scientific discourse. The ocean covers more than 70% of Earth's surface. The average depth is over 2 miles. More than 80% has never been mapped in detail. We have better topographic maps of Mars than we do of our own seafloor. The technology exists to change that. Autonomous underwater vehicles, advanced sonar arrays, satellite bathymetry, deep-sea submersibles that can withstand pressures in the deepest trenches. We could map the entire ocean floor if we chose to. We could explore every trench, every abyssal plain, every underwater mountain range. The cost would be substantial, but not prohibitive. Less than what we spend on space exploration in a single year. The scientific value would be immense. New species, new geological knowledge, better understanding of ocean currents and climate systems, potential resources. But we don't do it. Year after year, the deep ocean remains largely unexplored. Research funding goes to space programs instead. Mars rovers and Jupiter probes and telescopes looking at distant galaxies. We search for life on other planets while leaving most of our own planet unexplored. The official explanations make sense on the surface. The ocean is difficult to explore. The pressure is crushing. The darkness is absolute. The equipment required is expensive and specialized. Space captures public imagination in ways the ocean doesn't. Funding decisions are complex and based on multiple factors. All of that is true. But it doesn't explain the classified documents. It doesn't explain why scientists who asked too many questions ended up dead. It doesn't explain why certain coordinates are now off limits to civilian research. It doesn't explain the Abyss Protocol. There are places on Earth where humans are not permitted to go. Military installations, nuclear facilities, government research centres. We accept these restrictions as necessary for security. We understand that some things need to be kept secret for legitimate reasons. But the deep ocean isn't a military base or a nuclear facility. It's a natural part of our planet. It was here billions of years before humans existed. Restricting access to it, controlling who can explore it, hiding what's been found there. These actions suggest something more than routine security concerns. They suggest something was discovered that changed the fundamental understanding of who we are and whether we're alone. Something that people in power decided we're not ready to know. Something that has been kept secret for 50 years through classification, suppression, and when necessary, elimination of anyone who came too close to the truth. Marvin Eldridge died in 1978. Harlan Vick died in 2022. Lena Hart Boone disappeared in 2023. These are just the names we know. How many others were silenced? How many scientists, researchers, technicians, and engineers took secrets to their graves? How many chose silence over the risk of speaking out? The Abyss Protocol wasn't about preventing contact with something unknown. It was about managing information, controlling what humanity knows about its own planet, maintaining a narrative that humans are the only intelligent species on Earth, even in the face of evidence to the contrary. Someone, somewhere, made the decision that this secret was worth keeping, that whatever exists in the deep ocean should remain there, undisturbed and unknown, that NASA should explore space instead, that the public should believe we stopped exploring the oceans simply because space was more interesting. And for 50 years that decision has held, through changes in presidential administrations, through shifts in public opinion, through advances in technology that would make discovery easier. The secret has been maintained. Documents remain classified. Witnesses remain silent or dead. Research remains restricted. The satellite image from 2023 showed something that should not exist in nature. A hexagonal structure over 60 miles in perimeter, sitting at the deepest point on Earth, radiating heat, with an opening at its centre. It existed for 6 minutes on the internet before being scrubbed. But those who saw it remember. The structure is still there. The thermal signature hasn't changed. Military vessels continue to patrol the area. Permits continue to be denied. And somewhere in classified facilities, people monitor those depths, watching for changes, for activity, for signs that whatever agreement or understanding exists might be breaking down. The ocean keeps its secrets well, and in the crushing darkness of the deepest trenches, at pressures that would instantly kill any human, beneath miles of water where no light has ever reached, something exists. Something with geometric precision. Something that radiates heat. Something that noticed when we came looking in the 1970s and responded by shutting down our equipment. Something that may have been here long before humans walked the earth. Something that built structures in the deep ocean for purposes we can't begin to understand. Something that someone in power encountered and then decided humanity was better off not knowing about. NASA didn't choose space over ocean. They were pushed into space, ordered to look up instead of down, told to search for life on distant planets while ignoring the evidence of non-human intelligence right here on Earth. The choice was made, the protocol was established, and for 50 years it has been enforced with classification protocols, funding redirection, permit restrictions, and when necessary, permanent silence. The truth is down there, in the Mariana Trench, in the Puerto Rico Trench, in the Tonga Trench, in the deepest, darkest, most inaccessible places on our planet, waiting, watching, existing, and we have been told to leave it alone. Perhaps that was the right decision. Perhaps there are discoveries that humanity isn't ready for. Perhaps there are truths that would fundamentally break our understanding of the world in ways we couldn't recover from. Or perhaps those in power simply made a choice that they're not the ones suffering. They're not the ones who died asking questions, and they're not the ones who have to live with the weight of suppressed knowledge. The ocean covers 70% of our planet. It holds secrets we haven't even begun to imagine. And somewhere, in a facility with the highest security clearance, in a room where the protocols are enforced and the decisions are made, someone knows exactly what those secrets are. They've known since 1978, and they've decided you shouldn't.